Hello, and welcome to this clean historical Western romance by Martha Gillcrest. It's great to have you with us. Before we begin, be sure to hit the subscribe button, give this audiobook a thumbs up, and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple way allows us to share more heartwarming romance stories with you for free. Now, get cozy, relax, and escape into adventure and love with a host of new characters. Enjoy. The following book is the copyright of Martha Gillcrest. Finding Love for Two Lonesome Hearts by Martha Gillcrest. Chapter 1. Boston, Massachusetts, 1865. This ain't no time for daydreaming, Miss Roberts. Not unless you want your pay docked. Marcus Carden, the foreman at Flint Mill, tapped his foot impatiently as he examined her work. Sorry, Mr. Carden. Eliza jumped guiltily and shifted on her hard wooden chair, trying to get comfortable. Don't let me have to tell you again. Mr. Carden scowled and continued pacing along the long line of workers with his hands behind his back, enjoying the power he wielded over them. Eliza risked a glance around the cavernous room with a weary sigh. Every day, she wished for a different view, but her life revolved around Flint Mill, and she knew it was unlikely to change anytime soon. It was one of the largest weaving mills in Boston, and she was one of the hundreds of young women who operated the looms. The machines whirred and rattled with rhythmic repetitiveness all day long, vibrating as the levers and springs drove the shuttles across the loom, and the bobbins of wool twirled on their spindles so fast it made her feel dizzy to watch. Hour after hour, the colored pattern of the woven threads grew. Her pale hands controlled the machine that was double her size, and some days Eliza likened her work to being a conductor in an orchestra, bringing the fabric to life. She stifled a yawn and shifted her shoulders, trying to ease her muscles that burned with tiredness. Like most of the workers, she had mastered the machine's workings so well that she would have been able to do it with her eyes closed. However tempting it was, even on the days when she felt limp with exhaustion, she knew she couldn't give in to temptation. Any slight mistake or lack of concentration could mean the loss of a limb, or even worse. Only last week, a young boy had been crushed to death when he had drifted asleep for a second and slumped into the snatching jaws of the loom. So despite the bone-deep weariness that came from the long hours, she fought to keep her eyes open. But more importantly, Eliza knew that falling asleep while operating the machine could lead to her losing her precious job. It was something that she couldn't let happen. And she shivered at the irony that it filled her with fear more than the thought of losing a limb. How would I survive without a job? The thought occupied her mind almost every day, especially when she saw other workers being given the sack by Mr. Carden for any minor transgression, with casual disregard for the fact that they might end up homeless and penniless. The textile factory didn't pay enough to give anyone a decent life, just enough to scrape by as long as they were careful. And being a woman, Eliza received only half of what the men were paid, as though her work was somehow inferior. The women did the weaving, and the men maintained the machines. Mr. Carden never missed an opportunity to tell her she should be grateful they had deigned to employ her. Eliza could only nod in agreement as he dropped the pitiful number of coins into her hand once a week. Besides, work took all of her time and energy, so it wasn't as if she needed extra to enjoy any leisure activities, he had commented with a chuckle at their last payday. Eliza stifled another yawn and glanced at the large clock that hung above Mr. Carden's desk, measuring out her life, minute by minute. Even though it felt like hours had passed, she realized it had only been an hour since her shift had begun. Her eyes stung from the dust that hung in the air, and she could feel the familiar tickle at the back of her throat. The hacking sound of coughing was ever present in her line of work, even though one of the other women had told her that the mill inspectors had demanded better air quality and were trying to reform working conditions. Her mind drifted to her favorite distraction to help the day pass quicker, thinking about her childhood sweetheart, Nathan. No matter how hard her life felt, she knew that he was going through worse fighting at the war front. There was no basis to compare her hunger and harsh work conditions with the struggle and horror of war that she could only imagine. Eliza sighed wistfully, wishing the war would end soon so Nathan could return home to marry her. Her mouth curved into a soft smile as she remembered his promise the day before leaving Boston. "I always want to love and care for you, Eliza. Will you marry me as soon as I come home?" He had looked deep into her green eyes and clasped her hands to his chest as she agreed without a moment's hesitation. Even though she was sad to see him go off to fight in the war, his proposal had assured her of a happy future with the man she loved. Days turned to weeks and months, and his absence only made her heart grow fonder. When she closed her eyes, she could recall every line of his face and how his laughter always made her feel better, no matter how bad work had been. But now, Nathan had been gone for 4 long years, and the ache of missing him clutched her heart. She felt a ripple of panic as she tried to remember exactly what he looked like and couldn't. Her eyes misted with tears, and the loom in front of her blurred. "Miss Roberts, I won't tell you again. Stop sniveling this instant." Mr. Carden's harsh command wrenched her from the daydream, and she hastily wiped her eyes with the back of her hands. The rest of the morning passed slowly as Eliza applied herself to her task, determined not to do anything wrong again and risk their manager's wrath. When the factory was on a break by midday, Eliza joined other women to file into the dining room for lunch. Her stomach growled with hunger pangs, and she unwrapped the stale crust of bread that was all she could afford to bring. She scraped the green mold off the edge and ate it slowly to make it last, even though she wanted to wolf it down. "That ain't much to keep you going." A plump woman who had only recently started at the mill peered at Eliza's food and wrinkled her nose before sinking her teeth into her own ham sandwich. "I'm not very hungry," Eliza murmured. She sipped her mug of water, trying to ignore the mouth-watering smell of her neighbor's food. She could have told the woman that she barely earned enough to pay her rent and one proper meal in the evening, but pride prevented her. "I'm surprised your ma doesn't tell you to eat more," the woman chuckled, slapping her ample waistline cheerfully. Eliza nodded and sipped more water, not wanting to tell her that she was all alone until Nathan returned. Thinking back only brought more sad memories. Her parents had brought the family to America to escape the devastation of the Irish potato famine, only to be killed by typhoid when she was 16 years old. And her brother had left Boston for New York not long after, convinced that he would find a better life there without the demands of caring for his younger sister. Eliza had been abandoned, leaving her alone and lonely, but for the steadfast love of her childhood sweetheart, which was why she couldn't wait to see him again. The time between lunch and the close of work was the longest for Eliza. She was hungry and weak, yet she continued to feed the yarn into the loom hour after hour. The thought that Nathan might not have eaten for days too at war inspired her to work harder. By sunset, when the factory fell silent, Eliza walked home in the company of the other workers as they each turned off once they reached their homes. Although there were a few women she counted as acquaintances, she wouldn't call them friends. The ever-shifting population in her neighborhood and the fact that she wasn't part of a close-knit family had made her become reserved, always on the edge of the garrulous chatter and easy friendships the other women seemed to enjoy. Some of them whispered that she was stuck up, but the truth was that she was simply shy, thinking she had little to offer. "Out of our way." The coachman atop a horse-drawn carriage glared at her as it bowled past, and Eliza wondered what it would be like to live so grandly to afford the gleaming carriage and prancing pair of gray horses that pulled it. Eliza continued walking along the road, deep in thought. The only person that she found herself at peace with was Nathan. He knew the real Eliza, kind-hearted and talkative when her imagination was captured by something of interest. She couldn't wait for when he would return from the war, and they would marry. She could picture them by a cozy fire, Nathan reading aloud stories from the newspaper while she sewed in the chair opposite him, as her parents had done when she was a little girl. She yearned for an escape from the lonely and poverty-ridden life she had been enduring. Turning the corner, Eliza came to the ramshackle tenement building she called home. Climbing warily up the stairs, she tried to block out the noise of wailing babies and drunken shouting that never stopped. The door to her room had been painted blue once upon a time, but the paint had long since peeled away in the damp, and there was woodworm in the doorframe that made her worry about being able to keep it safely locked at night. Her spirits lifted as she spotted her neighbor sweeping the hallway. "Hello, Mrs. Jackson?" Eliza smiled as she felt in her pocket for her key. "Welcome home. Eliza, how was work today?" "I gave it my all, but it never seems to be enough to keep the manager happy." Mrs. Jackson nodded sympathetically before hurrying away to start cooking dinner for her own family. The brief conversation made Eliza feel slightly less alone as she let herself into her room. Closing the door behind her, Eliza hung up her shawl and bonnet. Her home consisted of one small room, with a rickety bed in one corner, and one chair next to a table that Mrs. Jackson had given her. She was luckier than some, because she also had a pot-bellied stove in the other corner, which allowed her to cook basic meals, and a bowl with a pitcher she used for washing her dishes and herself. The one window overlooked a narrow street below, but if she stood on her tiptoes, she could glimpse the park beyond. Eliza spooned out what was left of the vegetable stew she had left on the stove to keep warm into a bowl and ate it at the table, reading one of her ma's old books for company. The evening stretched ahead of her, and after washing her pots, she settled into the threadbare armchair and picked up her needle to work on the sampler she was sewing for when she and Nathan had their own home. The warmth of the evening and the food in her stomach soon made her eyes grow heavy, and within an hour, her head drooped forward onto her chest. She dreamt of Nathan walking toward her with open arms to take her into their home. She looked down at her belly and saw that she was expecting a baby, and Nathan's eyes were full of love as he looked at her tenderly. Suddenly, she jerked awake from her sleep, and her heart sank with disappointment that it had only been a dream. Surely this war can't last much longer. It was the only thought that she could cling to. Peering out of the window, Eliza realized it was dark, and the less savory folks of the town were out on the streets. Raucous laughter drifted up from the saloon at the end of the road, and she hastily checked that she had locked her door. She closed the drapes across the window and lay on the bed, but sleep had deserted her as her mind whirled with thoughts of Nathan and how much longer she might be alone. Lying awake, she stared at the ceiling, listening to the familiar noises of the dozens of other families who lived in the building. Eliza touched her stomach and smiled at the thought that she would carry Nathan's baby one day. It would be such a happy time in her life. The following day was Friday, and she was up at the crack of dawn. Being late to the mill would mean a deduction in her weekly wage that she could ill afford. She quickly splashed cold water on her face and twisted her long auburn hair into a bun before pulling on her plain brown calico dress and adding a bonnet. The dream she had had the night before stayed with her all day, making her life feel even more monotonous than usual. She longed to escape the drudgery, and her only hope was Nathan. The only thing that she could do was wait and wish him a safe return. At the beginning of the war, he had occasionally sent her a letter, but it had been many months since his last one. The only snippets of information she had about the war were what she overheard from the other women at work. It sounded brutal, and the soldiers had put up with extraordinary circumstances. But it was a matter of pride for Eliza that her fiancé was a soldier defending the land. That thought alone kept her happy and hopeful, and she told herself he would be back before the year was out. "I'm glad to see you seem to be concentrating better." Mr. Carden nodded pompously as he paced past her at the end of the day. A few minutes later, as the looms fell silent, he climbed onto the platform at the front of the room and signaled for everyone to listen. "We are exceptionally busy with new orders, so I have some additional work tomorrow afternoon for those of you who want it." Eliza's hand shot up as soon as he looked around. Even though she was exhausted, she needed the extra money, and it would make her afternoon off feel less lonely. "I only need 25 workers. Stay on until 6 o'clock in the evening, and I'll pay you immediately." "Yes, please, sir." Eliza pushed to the front, determined to be chosen. "As you wish. And no need to go around gossiping about this, all right?" Mr. Carden added cantankerously. Strictly speaking, the workers were meant to have Saturday afternoons off, but he was happy to ignore the rules if it helped him meet his quotas. I knew you would be the first to say yes, he said sourly, noting down her name in his ledger. It's not as if you have anything else to do, is it? He added, with a glint of malice in his eyes. Eliza thought of what the extra income could do to her and shrugged. Let him judge her. She didn't care. The additional wage would ensure she had a better meal on Sunday and maybe even enough for some better food for her lunches. She didn't expect others to understand her predicament. She was 25, unmarried, with no family, no savings, and no hope of escaping misery until Nathan returned from the war. If working harder helped the days pass and kept her from poverty, then that's what she would do, and one day it would all be worthwhile. Chapter 2. Boston, Massachusetts. Eliza placed her Bible back on the small shelf that held her books and sat in the sagging armchair. Usually a Sunday afternoon was her favorite part of the week. Church in the morning provided a welcome balm to her soul, and then she would spend the afternoon reading and sewing. It gave her a small respite from work to enable her to get through the rest of the week. She had worked additional hours on Saturdays for the last 4 weeks, and although it was only a few extra hours on top of the long days she already did, she felt wearier than usual. She closed her eyes, letting her mind drift to happier times. "Miss Roberts, are you in there?" A sharp rap at the door startled her, and she jumped up hastily, not recognizing the voice. "I'm coming. Who is it?" she asked. She wasn't expecting any visitors, and usually no one visited her other than the landlord, Mr. Romano, or Mrs. Jackson from next door. Eliza opened the door a crack and was surprised to see a man in a soldier's uniform standing outside. He was rough-shaven, and his eyes were bloodshot with exhaustion. "Good afternoon. Can I help you?" Eliza peered past him, not wanting to cause gossip from being visited in her home by a man. "Let us step outside," she added, joining him in the hallway. "My horse is tied up in the street." The soldier walked ahead of her, not giving her any clues about the purpose of his visit. She followed him to where his horse was hitched to some railings. "Are you from Nathan's regiment?" Eliza asked, unable to contain her curiosity for a moment longer. "Do you have news about when he will be home?" The soldier paused and looked down at his dusty boots. "I ain't so good with fancy words, ma'am, so I'll just come out and tell you straight. We lost Nathan." "Lost him? What?" Eliza shook her head, not quite understanding, as she imagined him being left behind somewhere as the rest of the regiment moved on without him. "I'm sorry. He was a brave soldier and fought hard to the end." Eliza felt as though she could hardly breathe. Her vision blurred as her eyes filled with tears, and she hastily wiped them away with her handkerchief, not wanting to show her distress. "When did this happen?" she asked, taking a shaky breath. "About 1 month ago now. Ma'am, I would have told you sooner, but I was only just granted some time to come home, and I'd promised Nathan I would tell you if anything happened to him." "A month ago?" Eliza whispered. She was shocked that she hadn't sensed it. All the times she had thought of Nathan in recent weeks, and he had already left this life forever. "If it comforts you, you should know that your fiancé was brave in battle." The soldier pulled a letter and some leather gloves from his saddlebag, handing them to her. "This is all I have of his to give you." He patted her arm to console her, then swung himself into his saddle. "I'm sorry to bring you such sad news, ma'am. Nathan was a good man, and he spoke very fondly of you. I hope you will find happiness with someone like him in the future." He lifted his hat, and the horse trotted away. Eliza stood there motionless, watching him leave. Her world had come crashing down in the space of just a few minutes, and everything she had hoped for became an illusion. Yet the sun was still shining, and everyone around her was going about their business as if nothing had changed. It seemed wrong. Eventually, she came to her senses and returned to her room. The tears rolled down her cheeks as she opened the letter. It was written in Nathan's hand, and she took a deep breath, reading it carefully. "My dear Eliza, it has been so long since we were together, but I know you think of me every day, as I also think of you, which gives me great comfort. The fighting is fierce, but I have some true and loyal soldiers at my side. We all like to talk about our home lives and what we will do after the war is over. I pray that the Lord will bless us with marriage and our own family when the time is right, and I hope your work at the mill is going okay. We shall be together soon, Eliza. Your loving fiancé, Nathan. Eliza held the letter close to her chest and sobbed as the full realization of his death sank in. It wasn't long before Mrs. Jackson came to her room, letting herself in quietly. "I saw you outside with the soldier. Has he brought bad news?" she asked gently. "Nathan has died in battle, Mrs. Jackson." Eliza tried to hold back her tears, but it was too hard. "Oh, my dear, I'm so sorry." Mrs. Jackson embraced her. She understood how upsetting Nathan's death would be for Eliza. She had often spoken of him, and Eliza had confided about her hopes and dreams for their life together once they were married. That dream had now disappeared. "A soldier who fought alongside Nathan was here just after I returned from church to tell me that he died 1 month ago," Eliza explained. She gestured at the letter and gloves. "This is all I have left of him. Sometimes these things just aren't to be," Mrs. Jackson said, trying to comfort her. She had lost her first husband in a terrible accident and knew how Eliza was suffering. "Trust in the Lord to help you through your grief, Eliza. One day it will feel better, I promise you." After consoling Eliza, Mrs. Jackson left her alone in the room. Eliza did not cry again, but remained pensive, sitting in her armchair, barely noticing the minutes tick by. She imagined Nathan's final moments as the brightness in his eyes became dull, and his laughter was replaced with gasps of pain. She hoped he hadn't suffered and tried to replace the terrible images in her mind with happier ones of when they had still been together. As the sun gradually sank, a stream of worries flooded Eliza's mind. But uppermost was the regret of the unfulfilled dream for herself and Nathan. The thought that they would have children together one day and live a happy life had vanished in the blink of an eye. Although her appetite had deserted her, Eliza forced herself to eat a small bowl of stew and lay out her clothes for work the next morning. The church clock across the park struck the hour, and Eliza lit a candle and knelt next to her bed. "Lord, thank you for the precious times Nathan and I enjoyed in the past, and for the soldier who brought news of his passing so I can mourn him properly. In your mercy, please grant me hope that one day I may still become a wife and mother someday, as Nathan would have wished. Amen." As Eliza lay in bed, waiting for sleep to come, she realized that she was now truly alone. Death had claimed all the people she loved most in the world, and her brother had made it clear he wanted nothing to do with her. The thought of life being so fragile underlined how much she longed to have a family of her own, a loving husband and children in a happy home. But who would marry her? She was under no illusion that a lowly worker at the mill with no savings would make an appealing wife. The idea that a man would one day find her attractive and want to be with her, regardless of her circumstances, was something that she couldn't imagine. Only Nathan had filled that role, and with him dead, the future looked bleak for her. The next few weeks passed in a blur, but Eliza had never been more grateful for her job at Flint Mill. The repetitive work gradually helped ease her grief, and she found herself able to look back fondly at her childhood sweetheart without the raw pain of trying to imagine a future without him. Mrs. Jackson had told her that life had to go on, and Eliza clung to her cheerful assurances that she would meet someone new, all in good time. Even Mr. Carden offered a few words of condolence, which shocked her. But more importantly, Eliza knew she couldn't afford the luxury of any time away from work. She had to eke out a living to pay for her rent and food, and a new order for the mill meant that they were being urged to work even longer hours than before. With her faith to support her, Eliza slowly embraced her new reality with a stoic determination to try and create some sort of meaningful life. She told herself that she owed it to Nathan to at least do that. "Why don't you come and join our quilting circle?" Mrs. Jackson asked one Monday evening when Eliza had got home from the mill. "It's only for an hour, and it will give you a chance to make a few more friends." Eliza paused outside her door, thinking of another lonely evening stretching ahead. "I'm not sure, Mrs. Jackson. I barely have enough money for the rent, let alone to purchase scraps of fabric, just for pleasure." "Nonsense, dear. The ladies use donations from church to make their quilts. You wouldn't believe some of the fine gowns the well-to-do women of Boston donate for us. You would hardly know they'd been worn." Eliza smiled at her neighbor and nodded. In that case, I'd like to join you. I decided to take your words to heart and look for new opportunities. As you said, who knows where they might lead. Wonderful. I'll call for you tomorrow evening, and we'll go together. Mrs. Jackson was glad to see that the color had returned to Eliza's cheeks after she had looked so pale and withdrawn following Nathan's death. Ma, what's for dinner? We're hungry. One of the Jackson children peeked out of their front door and gave Eliza a shy smile. I'll look forward to it, Eliza said, meaning it. Eliza hummed happily as she cooked her simple dinner of beef stew. She enjoyed sewing, and Mrs. Jackson's invitation had given her a glimmer of optimism and something to look forward to for the first time in weeks. Just as she was settling down to read, there was a knock at the door. Eliza was already smiling as she stood up to open it, thinking it would be Mrs. Jackson again. But the smile vanished from her face when she saw her landlord standing there with his arms folded. Mr. Romano, I wasn't expecting to see you. Eliza felt flustered and wondered for a moment if she had got her days muddled up. She was sure it was still another week until the rent was due, but losing Nathan had filled her thoughts so much she might have been mistaken. I heard your news, Miss Roberts. It's a terrible thing for such a charming young lady to lose her fiancé. Eliza looked into his swarthy features, wondering whether he had been drinking. Usually, Mr. Romano was in a bad mood when he called, full of indignation about the tenants who had fallen behind on their rent, and this sudden kindness had caught her off guard. Thank you, she stuttered. Nathan was my soldier sweetheart, a childhood friend. He was killed in battle a while ago now. My apologies for your loss, miss. Mr. Romano's eyes narrowed, and he glanced along the hallway. I came as soon as I heard. His Sicilian background lent him an exotic air, but Eliza still felt a shiver of foreboding. She had heard rumors that he was not a man to be crossed. Thank you, Mr. Romano. I appreciate your kindness. He nodded curtly. So, now that we have that out of the way, what about your rent? It's due today, or have you forgotten? Eliza felt as if he'd slapped her. Mr. Romano, don't you have any feelings for me? I just lost someone very dear. Times are hard, but I shall do my very best to pay what I owe you. I've even been working extra hours. Could you come back on Friday? Mr. Romano's lip curled with contempt. I have no time for such requests. If you want to continue to live in my house, you should pay the rent. It's that simple. It's only a few more days to wait, Mr. Romano, Eliza pleaded. I'm all alone, and I've never missed a payment in all these years, not once. Please won't you take pity on me and help me? It's help you want, is it? Mr. Romano's hooded eyes gleamed with an emotion Eliza found hard to read. I'm a generous man, Miss Roberts. There is one way that I could help you, and I am sure you would appreciate it. What is it, Mr. Romano? I would be very grateful. His gaze raked over her gown, lingering on her womanly curves where her dress fitted more snugly. If you want to get out of this wretched life of yours, be my wife. Eliza gasped with shock. What did you just say? Surely you are joking. I just told you I lost my sweetheart. How could you be so cruel? Let me put it this way. You don't really have a better option, do you? He chuckled and rested his hand on her shoulder. A fine-looking woman like you shouldn't be alone. If you marry me, you will move out of this crowded building and live in my house with no more rent to pay. What gives you the impression that I would be interested in marrying you? She shot back. Why shouldn't you be interested? Unless you are too foolish to see that I have offered you a way out of your poverty. As my wife, you get to live free of worries. You will have all the good things you desire. It's time to put that young man who died in battle behind you because you are nothing without him. Eliza exhaled deeply and tried to remain composed. Every part of her wanted to slam the door in his face, but she was afraid of his anger and what he might do. Mr. Romano, I appreciate your interest in someone like me. It has come as a surprise. I need time to think about it. Until then, I will get your rent money as soon as possible. That's fine, Eliza. Mr. Romano turned away to leave, but before he had taken more than a few steps, he stopped and raised his hand as though just remembering something. Lest I forget, the rent is now double what you currently pay. There is a long queue of potential tenants willing to pay more for the room you occupy. It's your choice. Eliza knew that Mr. Romano only dared to talk to her in such a condescending manner because of her poverty. She hated and feared the man in equal measure, and her face flushed pink from the swirl of emotions running through her veins. What am I going to do now? The thought of his proposal filled her with terror. He was almost 3 times her age, but what worried her more was his reputation. He was a dangerous man, rumored to be part of a gang who thought nothing of taking their revenge on people who owed them money. Mr. Romano had a hand in everything evil in Boston and beyond, and she knew that he would not be pleased if she spurned his advances. She rubbed her hands on her arms and shivered with fear and anxiety, knowing she was at a crossroads. Who knew what he might be capable of if she refused his proposal? But she couldn't afford to leave the security of her modest home and risk ending up on the streets. And she would have to face him every month when he came to collect the rent. The danger she faced was very real and threatened every part of her quiet life. She was lost in thought about what to do about her dilemma when she heard someone knock on her door. Startled, Eliza opened it nervously, only to see Mrs. Jackson standing outside. Chapter 3. Boston, Massachusetts. "Mrs. Jackson, you startled me," Eliza said as she opened the door. The door creaked even though she opened it slowly. She came out of the room to meet her neighbor. "I apologize for that. I was worried about you. How are you?" Mrs. Jackson noticed her pale expression and how Eliza kept nervously glancing toward the stairwell as though expecting someone to suddenly appear. "Was that Mr. Romano I saw leaving just now?" She pursed her lips. The landlord had a reputation for terrifying people, and she could tell that something was troubling her young neighbor. "What did he want from you?" she added, genuinely worried for Eliza's well-being. Eliza cleared her throat before she started to speak. "He came for the rent. I asked him to give me a little more time to pay, but he refused." Mrs. Jackson shook her head. "Mr. Romano doesn't take kindly to people not giving him money. Did you tell him of your grief and how difficult things have been for you? Maybe he has a shred of compassion somewhere within him." "I did, but it made no difference." Eliza blushed and looked down at the dusty floorboards. "That's not all, though. He suggested I should be his wife and live with him for free." "He did what? The man is almost 60 years old." Mrs. Jackson looked shocked and fanned herself with her apron. "What did you tell him?" "The idea is ridiculous. He barely knows you, Eliza, but I do hope you didn't say no to his face. A man like him can't bear to lose." "How could I even raise my voice against him? I was too scared to even look at his face. You know the things people say about him." "Did you agree to marry him?" Mrs. Jackson looked troubled. "You poor thing, what a dreadful dilemma. And after everything you've already endured." "No, never. Even the thought of it makes me sick. I may have gotten over my grief for Nathan, but I could never agree to marry a scoundrel like Mr. Romano. I hate everything he stands for. It would be the worst way to honor Nathan's memory if I ended up marrying someone with such a reputation for cruelty and violence." "So you said no? That's still not a good idea. He may come after you. That man is as sly as a fox and wicked too. You have to watch your back now constantly, Eliza. You can't walk home alone from work, especially not after dark. Is it true that he's done such dreadful things?" Eliza shivered again, wondering how she had put herself in such a precarious situation when all she wanted was to stay in her lodgings without fear. Mrs. Jackson looked sideways to see if someone was eavesdropping on their conversation. Not satisfied that no one was listening to them, she held Eliza's hand and led her to the tree outside the building. "I don't want anyone to hear what we say and go and tell him. You see, Mr. Romano is a dangerous man. Now that he has made his suggestion, he won't let it go. Whether it's for the rent or for you, Eliza, he has you in his mind, which is not good. My husband always says we have to keep him sweet and stay out of his way, but it's too late for that for you." "Surely he can't break the law in such a brazen way," Eliza countered. "What if the police found out?" Mrs. Jackson gave a hollow laugh. "Men like him don't care about the law. He's been known to make people's lives miserable for the slightest provocation." She lowered her voice. "Rumor has it that he pays the lawmen to turn a blind eye to his shady dealings. And when one of them tried to go against his wishes, he was killed in mysterious circumstances." "I'm in big trouble now." Maybe if I just try and scrape the rent together, he'll be satisfied? Eliza frowned, already knowing she would never be able to pay double what she was already putting aside each week. He had put her in an impossible situation. If you ask me, the rent is not the main issue now. Not anymore. No one says no to Mr. Romano. If he's determined to marry you, he'll find a way. I am scared now. What am I going to do, Mrs. Jackson? Eliza wished fervently that Nathan was still alive to protect her. Mrs. Jackson looked thoughtful. I think the only option left for you is to leave Boston without delay. I wish there was something different I could suggest, but we would be foolish to underestimate what he can do to you or anybody. Why is this happening to me? I've never enjoyed any peace or experienced joy in my young life. Then this fresh demand from Mr. Romano. What am I going to do? The bluntness of her neighbor's suggestion made Eliza frustrated at the unjustness of her situation. Mrs. Jackson looked straight at Eliza. You have to face reality now. Mr. Romano will always be who he is, a mean and deadly man. You can flee from him, or you remain here and live in fear that he will have his wicked way with you. She clasped Eliza's hand. I don't want that for you, my dear. Maybe a fresh start somewhere new could be a silver lining from all your tragedy. Where will I go to? I have no parents. My brother is in New York with no thought for my welfare. Nathan is dead. So here I am, being forced to leave the only place I know and my job as well. Eliza's face creased with worry. I'm a single woman with no money to her name. Perhaps I could take a job as a governess, but I have no experience with children. I have a better idea, Mrs. Jackson said with a sudden smile. What is it? I think you can still get away from here without worrying about who you could stay with. How is that even possible? It seems you haven't been listening to me. I have been listening, Eliza. Do you remember what you told me about wanting to have a family, a husband and children of your own, with a happy home and you at the heart of it? Eliza shook her head, wondering whether Mrs. Jackson had been paying attention to her plight. Yes, I do. But what has that got to do with me now? Did I not tell you about Nathan? What you're describing sounds like a dream, but not one that I will be part of for many years, I'm sure. Maybe never, if Mr. Romano is as bad as you say. I understand, but that's not what I'm talking about. You see, my niece got a well-to-do man to marry her, and it was her escape from this place. I think you can too. She's not even as beautiful as you are. I am anything but beautiful. Just tell me about your niece and forget about my looks. Mrs. Jackson smiled again. I admire your modesty, Eliza, but you turn heads without even realizing. Anyway, my niece got married to a fine gentleman from the West. Eliza looked puzzled. Did he visit her here before the wedding? How did they meet and start courting? Haven't you heard of the matrimonial times? She saw an advertisement in the newspaper about a certain gentleman seeking a wife. There were lots of advertisements, as I recall. You'd be amazed how many gentlemen out west are looking to marry a suitable young lady. So she replied to the advertisement, and they wrote to each other for a little while, and they are now happily married. Just like that? Eliza could hardly believe what her friend was telling her. It sounded far too good to be true. Yes, my dear, just like that. Mrs. Jackson nodded enthusiastically. I was skeptical too when she first told me, but it has worked out very well for her. They live on the edge of a small town, and everyone is very friendly, the way she describes it in her letters to my sister. It all started with her responding to the advertisement. That's all. Eliza looked quizzical as she asked, but they never met each other before that time, did they? No, but it worked out for them, and I think you should try it too. I don't think I can do that. It's not my kind of thing to do. You know that I don't have many friends. Why would a complete stranger find me appealing? But do you have a choice now? Mrs. Jackson said gently. You deserve a fresh start, Eliza, and who knows how matters of the heart work. A nice gentleman might catch your eye, and you could fall in love through correspondence. If you can just keep Mr. Romano at arm's length for a while, it could work out perfectly for you. Eliza became pensive again, but Mrs. Jackson continued. Think of it this way. You would have a husband, and it would be in a far nicer place than this. Nathan would have wanted that for you, she added, pressing home her advantage as she saw Eliza waver. Do you really think it could work for me as well as it did for your niece? I've never loved anyone other than Nathan, and starting all over, especially in this manner, will be difficult for me. Think of it as a life-saving opportunity and a means to an end. With time, you could learn to have affection and possibly even love for anyone that you choose. It's never going to be easy, but I suppose it wouldn't harm to look at the newspaper. Mrs. Jackson clapped her hands happily. I never said it would be an easy thing for you to do. You just have to try. What's the name of the newspaper again? The Matrimonial Times. I happen to have a copy upstairs for you to look at. Now it was Eliza's turn to smile. You already had this idea before Mr. Romano's visit, did you? Maybe. Mrs. Jackson linked arms with Eliza, and they strolled back into the building. I figured it worked so well for my niece that it might be beneficial to you as well. What better way to spend your evening than choosing a potential husband? Chapter 4. Fairville, Oregon, 1865. Summit Lake Ranch, just outside Fairville, Oregon, was quiet in the hot afternoon sun. The rolling paddocks stretched as far as the woods that cloaked the bottom of the mountains, and the breeze made the grass shimmer as though it was like water. Sturdy cattle grazed, flicking their tails against the flies, and high overhead, a pair of eagles circled. At the center of the ranch, there was a generous homestead consisting of a log cabin that had weathered to a silvery red color, flanked by a large kitchen garden with apple trees and tidy lines of vegetables. Several barns stood next to the pens and corrals where the Landelle family sorted their stock and stored the feed for the long winter months, and chickens scratched in the dust, darting after insects. David Landelle, the head of the family, stood up from his seat on the veranda and reached for his cane. The cherrywood handle was smooth from years of holding it in the curve of his palm, but he frowned as he always did when he needed the cane. In his mind, he was still a strong, fit young man, but his aching body told him otherwise. He couldn't put it off any longer. It was time to make plans for the ranch's future and hand over the reins to make sure all his hard work over the previous years would provide the legacy he had always wanted, Summit Lake Ranch to stand for. Are you ready for our meeting, Saul? And you too, Thomas? David called across to the nearest barn where his two sons were working side by side, mending one of the wagons. His voice sounded strained, and Mary, the matriarch of the family, watched anxiously as he turned to shuffle into the cool interior of the cabin. This looks very serious, Thomas quipped a few moments later after coming inside. He pulled off his leather gloves and dropped them on the table, reaching for a glass of water to quench his thirst. Is it going to take long, Pa? I need to ride out and check the cattle. Mary bustled around the table, putting a plate with a slice of cold pie in the center. Don't rush your Pa, she murmured, giving both of her sons a warning glance. You know he wouldn't call you away from your work if it wasn't important. Thomas and Saul exchanged glances, suddenly worried that something was terribly wrong. David took a sip of strong black coffee and regarded his sons over the rim of his cup. They both looked similar, with their bright blue eyes from Mary's side of the family, but Saul had curly brown hair, unlike Thomas's sandy color. But in demeanor, they couldn't be more different. As the eldest, Thomas had always been a daredevil, up to mischief whenever he thought he could get away with it. Saul was more cautious and liked to think things through, taking his time rather than rushing hastily into a decision he might come to regret. But they balanced each other out, Mary always said, like two sides of a coin. Reckon it's time we talked about the future of the ranch, David said slowly, putting his coffee cup down. I'm finding it hard to carry on working the land, with these legs of mine getting weaker. He rubbed his blue-veined hand on his knees, as though trying to will them to regain their strength. There's plenty of life left in you yet, Pa. Thomas sat back in his chair and stretched his long legs out. I've thought about it, and I don't want any falling out like so many ranching families have. Mary nodded and sat next to David, smiling at him to show she agreed with his decision. Your ma and I have decided it's time to split the ranch in two, so you both have your own land to make something of. You can share tools if it makes sense to do so, and everything will be divided equally. Saul gulped down some water to cover his surprise. It was as if their father was giving out their inheritance while he was still alive. But he hadn't put it that way. "Are you sure that's what you want to do, Pa?" he asked carefully. "Uh-huh." David nodded firmly. "I'll divide the assets and hand everything over to you two. No quarrels, each one with his own parcel of land. I'm getting too old for this now, and your ma deserves a few easier years as well. We've worked hard to make the place what it is, and now it's your turn," he declared. Thomas and Saul were quiet as they worked for the rest of the day, each deliberating on what their father had said. It had come as a complete surprise to them, but in some ways, it made good sense. The Landelle ranch was large enough to ensure that each person would have a substantial asset to himself, what with the land, the cattle, and horses, and they could share the barns for storing the precious winter fodder. "I guess Pa wants us to both have an equal chance to make a success of ourselves," Thomas muttered, pausing from his task of digging a hole for a fence post. "Do you think it's because of the rift between him and Uncle Hal?" Saul lifted his hat and wiped the sweat from his brow, considering Thomas's comment. David rarely spoke about his brother, their Uncle Hal, but Mary had told them once that there had been a bitter falling out between David and Hal when they had first started working together to build Summit Lake Ranch. Hal had been lazy and frittered away money on gambling and women until David had insisted he must stop before they risked losing everything. Hal had stormed out, telling David that he would try his luck finding work in Philadelphia instead. And the last they had heard, he was the happy proprietor of a saloon where he could gamble to his heart's content. The experience had left a lasting belief in David that it was better to work alone and be your own master instead of being beholden to someone else. "I thought we were getting along fine this way, working together without fear of a rift, but I suppose that business with Uncle Hal left its mark on Pa. I'm just surprised he didn't ask if it's what we wanted too," Saul said, still surprised at their father's decision. Thomas shrugged. They both know that their father would have given much thought to what he announced to them before doing so. His decision was because he didn't want any conflict between his children and their families. He slid the new post into its hole. "Can I leave you to finish this? I promised Blanche I would be back home in good time." "Of course, it won't take me long. Tell Ma I'll be back shortly." Saul hammered nails into the fence rails, double-checking that everything was secure. Once he had finished, he sat on a log and took his hat off, enjoying the cooling breeze and the peacefulness of the evening. It was a good life, and he couldn't imagine being anywhere else, but his pa's announcement tugged at his mind, making him feel unsettled in a way that he couldn't quite understand. He watched the cattle against the glowing sunset and turned the conversation over in his mind again. "What's bothering me, Ruby?" he asked quietly, standing up and unhitching his mare's reins. She snickered and nuzzled his pocket, hoping for a piece of apple. Saul mounted his horse and set off at a steady lope along the track. "Must be all this talk of family in the future," he muttered to himself. Later that evening, after the rest of his family had gone to bed, Saul took a cup of coffee outside. Sitting on the veranda, looking up at the stars and the vast sky and the faint outline of the mountain ridge, was his favorite thing to do at the end of a busy day. It gave him time to let his mind mull over ranch matters without feeling hurried, or just to enjoy the solitude and give quiet thanks to the Lord for his life. He knew he was more fortunate than many, but this evening the cool night air didn't have its usual calming effect. His devoted collie looked up at him and pressed against his leg with a soft whine. "It ain't nothing you've done, Maisie." Saul ruffled the dog's soft head, and she lay back down at his feet, her tail thumping briefly with happiness at the sound of her master's voice. Saul knew what was bothering him. He just didn't want to admit it. He was lonesome and had been for some time, since Thomas had gotten married, to be precise. Thomas and Blanche had become husband and wife 4 months ago when the ranch had still been blanketed in snow. It had been a joyous day celebrating with their neighbors, and nobody had been happier for the newlyweds than Saul. But now he was starting to wonder whether it would ever happen for him too. He shifted in his chair and drained the last of his coffee. Thinking about his situation was not something he was used to doing. He preferred to leave his future in the safe hands of the Lord. But all this talk of splitting up the ranch meant he had to face up to the fact that he wasn't getting any younger. He would be 35 on his next birthday. By that age, his pa had set up the ranch, and his ma was busy raising him and Thomas. It's not as if I haven't been looking for love. The thought gave him no comfort. Saul had always assumed he would find a woman to capture his heart in Fairville, but the local town seemed to have let him down. Many of the men on neighboring ranches ventured over the mountains to go to cattle fairs and traveling shows to meet women from elsewhere, but that didn't appeal to Saul. Lately, even his ma had dropped a few hints that he might need to be more adventurous. Only last week, she had surprised him with a smart new vest she had made for him, telling him that he might want to wear it to the summer dance, with a twinkle in her eye. "Do you reckon she was saying, 'I'm kind of predictable'?" he muttered to his collie with a rueful smile. He had to admit he'd gotten into a rut over the last few years. Life consisted of working on the ranch, attending church, and occasional visits to town for supplies. Other than those places, he had no opportunities to become acquainted with the sort of woman he hoped might catch his eye and want to marry him. In the past, it had never really bothered him. He'd had a few friendships that he'd hoped might blossom into love, but when they hadn't, he'd assumed it was because they weren't a perfect match and trusted that it would happen all in good time. But seeing how happy Thomas was since he'd started courting Blanche had left him feeling as though something was missing from his life. His previous contentment in his own company started to chafe, and he couldn't help but feel curious about what his life would be with a wife, too. Saul had noticed the sudden change in his brother. The way he dressed more smartly for church, how he hurried home to the log cabin at the end of the day to be with Blanche, and how often their laughter rang out when they strolled through the meadows as Thomas got her acquainted with life on the ranch. It had filled Saul with a renewed energy to find a bride of his own, and he had decided to spend more time in church and volunteered to help with small projects in Fairville for the community. But so far, it had amounted to nothing more than several elderly spinsters remarking about what a wonderful husband he would make for someone, much to Thomas's amusement. Saul sighed and turned in for the night, hoping that his luck might change before much longer. "What's gotten into you?" Thomas raised his eyebrows as Saul stomped toward the barn the following morning. It was rare to see his brother in a bad mood, but Saul seemed distracted and distant. "You were late getting up this morning, which ain't like you." "Nothing," Saul snapped. He kicked a stone, and it bounced against the bottom rail of the corral, making the horses snort with surprise. "It doesn't look like nothing from where I'm standing. Even Maisie's giving you a wide berth this morning." Saul shrugged and then let out a long sigh before turning to Thomas with an apologetic grin. "Sorry, you're right. I'm feeling out of sorts." In the distance, he could see Blanche hanging some of Thomas's shirts on the washing line in the orchard, and she waved happily as she caught sight of Thomas. Saul sighed again at the picture of two people very much in love. "Well, I know it's not because you're lazy," Thomas chuckled. It was a standing joke in their family that Mary had once thrown cold water on Thomas as he slumbered past sunup, telling him only lazy folks slept like hibernating bears. He'd never overslept again. "Come on, Saul, you can tell me what's troubling you. Blanche says I'm a good listener." At the mention of Blanche's name, Saul frowned and strode off ahead of Thomas, with a firm set to his shoulders. "Lucky for you," he muttered. Thomas hurried after him, grabbing his arm. "Has a young woman turned you down? Is that what's making you meaner than a riled-up hornet?" Saul exhaled deeply and thrust his hands into his pockets before responding. "You're right, Thomas. Pa's plan got me thinking about how regimented and boring my life has become. It's all work and precious little fun. I couldn't sleep for fretting about it." "I understand," Thomas responded, sounding kinder than before. "I'm not sure you do. From what I can make out, there are no nice women of my age in the church or even the whole of Fairville. I'm happy for you and Blanche, Thomas, but what if I never find anyone? I don't want to have to go away to find love. But..." Saul shrugged again, looking glum. "Why do you think I found Blanche the way I did? Thomas smiled, relieved that Saul's problem was not something worse. I realized there weren't enough beautiful, kind young ladies and took a different route. Yes, but a mail-order bride? I'm not sure it would work for me, Thomas. You're far more outgoing. We both know that. Thomas slapped his brother on his shoulder. Nonsense. That's the good thing about it. You'll find the sort of woman who matches you. I might not get as lucky as you did. Luck had nothing to do with it, Thomas replied, glancing in Blanche's direction with love in his eyes. I wasn't sure I would meet someone as wonderful as Blanche, Blake, but you can see for yourself that it worked out just fine. Maybe a little prayer for the right woman to see your advertisement wouldn't go amiss. Thomas's convincing argument got Saul thinking. Whatever reservations he had against the mail-order bride system were hard to hang on to because his brother had tried the system, and it worked for him. There was no denying it. Saul thought of his frustrations at getting a wife in Fairville. The scarcity of young women in their farming community was a problem, which was why newspapers like the Matrimonial Times existed. He had just assumed he wouldn't need to resort to using it. Now that he thought about it, it seemed like a slightly foolish assumption. Thomas watched the different emotions chase across his brother's face. Give it a try. What have you got to lose? At the worst, it will cost you a few dollars to place your advertisement and send some letters. At the best, you'll have yourself a delightful new wife, just like my sweet Blanche. Think how happy Ma and Pa would be about that. Thanks, brother, Saul said to Thomas. They shook hands amicably and continued on to the barn where their day's chores awaited. Chapter 5, Fairville, Oregon, 1865. Mrs. Della's matrimonial agency was conveniently located just across the street from the mercantile store, which meant that Saul had no excuse not to go in a week later when Mary asked him to buy flour and sugar on his regular trip into Fairville. The bell on the back of the door tinkled as Saul took his hat off and sheepishly announced his arrival. Good day, Mrs. Della. Saul stood awkwardly on the doormat, and she rushed forward to greet him. Mr. Landelle, how lovely to see you outside of church. How can I be of help to you? Mrs. Della scarcely came up to Saul's shoulder, and she gave him a coy smile as she ushered him in. Has your brother persuaded you to follow his lead? It seems that way. Before Saul could have second thoughts, Mrs. Della scurried around her desk and sat down. She perched her glasses on her nose, looking at him expectantly. You're here for my help to find a bride? Dear Thomas, what a happy ending that was. Blanche is quite delightful. Mrs. Della offered Saul a seat. Please sit. What brings you here? Saul shuffled in his seat. The room was a shade too warm, and he ran a finger around his collar. I have to confess I'm a little skeptical, but my brother thinks this may work for me too. He glanced around to check that nobody he knew had spotted him coming in. That's only natural, but you'd be surprised how many gentlemen of Fairville have used my services. Why don't you start by telling me what kind of bride you would like? Saul pondered her direct question and felt himself relaxing slightly. Mrs. Della had a way of making him feel as though it wasn't really so strange to be discussing matters of the heart with a complete stranger. Kind-hearted, someone who values having a family and a modest life. He scratched his chin and thought some more. Beautiful, perhaps, but not someone who preens in front of the mirror. And most important of all, a woman who would be happy to live on my ranch. Mrs. Della had been writing his request down, and she paused at the last part. Do you own a ranch? Well, yes, but I would rather not make a big deal of that matter other than to make sure the woman is happy to live without some of the conveniences of town. I believe being on the land might not suit everyone. Mrs. Della nodded and smiled. We can mention that you have a homestead and land, but I'll word it so as not to attract a bride who is only after wealth and an easy life. I grew up on a ranch myself, Mr. Landelle, so I know how much hard work it can be. Saul looked on as Mrs. Della wrote down all the pieces of information that he gave her. His age and how he would prefer a wife to be a little younger than him. His hope was that his bride would be educated enough to read and do simple figures to help him with the business accounts. He said that he understood a bride might be widowed with children, which he didn't mind, as long as they might also have children together. "I think I have everything I need to place your advertisement," Mrs. Della said happily a few minutes later. Saul twisted his hat in his hands, still looking anxious. As he had described the bride he hoped to meet, he had felt the first glimmer of excitement and optimism, but as he handed over the coins to pay for the advert, he told himself not to expect too much and set himself up for disappointment. "I'll be in touch as soon as I have news." Mrs. Della showed him to the door. Before he left, she placed a plump hand on his arm and gave him an earnest look. "Nearly all the gentlemen who come here for my help think it won't work. I tell them to have faith. The fact that you are ready to open your heart to love means that the Lord will help you. I'm a firm believer in that. And of course, I will also help you," she added with a musical laugh. Saul put it to the back of his mind and busied himself with work at the ranch. In spite of Mrs. Della's reassurances, he was not expecting any woman to be interested in him. It was not that he thought he wasn't a decent sort of person, but it seemed too good to be true. But at least being more intentional about getting married had pleased his ma, who was already hinting about having grandchildren to dote on. Because of his skepticism, it was something of a shock when Mrs. Della scurried to intercept him as he left the church several weeks later. "Wait a moment, Mr. Landelle. May I have a word?" Her face was pink, and she was out of breath as she caught up with him. Saul braced himself for bad news, already thinking of how he would explain to Thomas and his ma why nobody had responded to his advertisement. "Good morning, Mrs. Della." He lowered his voice, not wanting anyone to overhear. "I've been kind of busy on the ranch, and I figured there was no point coming in to see you. I'm sorry to have wasted your time." "Wasted my time?" She blinked and then smiled, pulling a letter from her reticule. "I have good news, Mr. Landelle. That's what I wanted to tell you. This is a reply to your advertisement from a nice young lady called Eliza Roberts, who would like to correspond with you." "Is this real?" Saul asked with surprise in his face and voice. "Yes, of course. I hope you're not calling my work into question." Mrs. Della chuckled, showing that she was used to such a response. "She lives in Boston." "So, what now?" Saul felt so shocked that he could hardly think straight. "Now that you've had her response to your advertisement, you should write back to her and see what happens from there. Do you understand?" Saul nodded and thanked Mrs. Della, and then he continued his journey home to share his good news. The next few weeks settled into a steady rhythm that felt at the same time new and comforting to Saul. From reading that first brief reply of Eliza's, he felt a pull of interest and affection, which surprised him. She had told him little of her situation in the reply, merely saying that she thought he sounded like a fine, hard-working gentleman who she would like to get to know more of through their letters. She explained that she lived alone in a small room and worked long hours operating a loom in a mill, but hoped that he would consider her reply with kindness to give her a chance. Saul pulled the reply from his bedside cabinet and read it every evening before turning down his lamp, trying to picture Eliza in her surroundings. There was a humility in her reply that he found appealing. He recalled that when Blanche had written to Thomas, her letters had been full of confidence that he would choose her. By comparison, he liked how Eliza seemed a little unsure of herself because he felt the same way. "Come on then, brother. Aren't you going to tell us all about her?" Thomas had raised his glass of water, full of cheerful congratulations, when Saul had casually mentioned that he'd had a reply. His teasing gaze had felt intrusive, and Saul shook his head. "Leave him be." Mary scolded every time Thomas asked about it. Secretly, she was delighted when she realized what Saul had done, but she was wise enough to keep her excitement to herself. Her younger son often reminded her of a colt, easily spooked when it came to love, and the last thing she wanted was for the family's good-natured nosiness to put him off. She knew there had been several friendships with young women in Fairville over the years that had looked promising, but they had fizzled out. Saul had only shown his exasperation about it once, declaring that he was better off alone. His despair had tugged at Mary's heartstrings, as only a mother could understand. She wanted her son to find love, but it seemed that too many ladies mistook his quiet demeanor for being shy and boring, even though she knew that underneath he was steadfast and loyal. traits that surely the right woman would appreciate. For the next couple of months, Saul and Eliza exchanged letters. Saul kept the matter mostly to himself, but made sure to dispatch his letter at least once a week. Gradually, Saul and Eliza talked about many things, and like a flower opening its petals, Saul started to get a better sense of what Eliza was like. She spoke warmly of her parents and the way her childhood had been filled with love and kindness, even though money had been in short supply. He smiled as he read the descriptions of the people she worked with, who seemed to have colorful pasts and complicated love lives that they enjoyed discussing on the walk to and from the mill. He also learned that Eliza had been engaged to marry, but her sweetheart had been killed in battle. At first, he felt a pang of jealousy at the mention of her late fiancé, but then he told himself that he was being silly. If anything, the quiet admiration for his sacrifice in her letters showed that she was a kind-hearted woman. "Might she feel like that about me someday, Maisie?" Saul let her latest letter rest on his knees and stroked the dog's ears. If anyone was privy to his innermost hopes and dreams, it was his faithful hound. She nuzzled his hand, and her tail thumped on the wooden deck as she wagged it. "You reckon so?" he asked, chuckling. The dog yipped and then lay at his feet, settling into a doze as Saul let his thoughts wander. Even though he had started to imagine himself married to Eliza, there was one issue that was giving him pause. Thomas's wife, Blanche. At first, the changes had been small. Where Blanche had been meek and biddable before the wedding, he had noticed that in recent weeks she was becoming more demanding. Only yesterday, he had overheard her firmly telling Thomas that he should be more assertive when it came to matters on the ranch. "Your pa is past his prime, Thomas, and you are the eldest. Let's not forget it. It's time for you to take the reins now. Never mind having to always do everything the same old-fashioned way your parents did." Saul had been shocked to hear her talk in such a way. When they were around the dinner table in the evening, she seemed no different from how she had always been, but this had revealed a new side to her. He had put it down to being a one-off, but this morning, as he had stacked hay in the barn, he had seen Blanche striding across the paddock. Although he didn't want to listen to their conversation, he'd had no choice. "I'm worried about this woman Saul is writing to," Blanche had cried once she had Thomas's attention. "What if she turns out to be the wrong sort of person for this family, Thomas? It could ruin our chances of doing well. She might cause all sorts of upset." Saul leaned back in his chair and looked up at the night sky, full of confusion. Part of him wanted to leap to Eliza's defense and tell his family that she wasn't like that at all. But ironically, Blanche's scathing comments and the way she seemed to be changing were proof that it was a big risk getting into a marriage with someone he barely knew. What if Eliza turns out to not be the sweet person she portrays in her letters, Maisie? What if I get into something that I can't get out of? Saul knew himself well enough to know that if he committed to marriage, he would never turn his back on his bride. But the thought of spending his life with someone who might not be well matched to his modest ways was almost worse than the idea of remaining a bachelor. Blanche's new demanding manner had chilled him to the bone. As she became an intrinsic part of the family, there was no doubt that her behavior was starting to change for the worse. He sighed and shook his head. "Love sure is complicated," he muttered, standing up and stretching. Maisie jumped up and followed him inside, but Saul's mind was still on his dilemma. His biggest fear was that if he went ahead to marry Eliza, she too might become as demanding as Blanche, and together the women could wreak havoc on the Landelle family and fortune. But Thomas still seemed happy in his marriage, he told himself. Maybe it was just Blanche trying to find her place in the family. Saul wanted to give Eliza the benefit of the doubt, so he decided to keep responding to the letters until he was convinced they were on the right track. His spirits lifted as he pushed his doubts away, and he allowed himself to look forward to Eliza's next letter with a sense of happy anticipation. Chapter 6. Fairville, Oregon. "This dinner looks mighty tasty, Mary." David Landelle gave his wife a fond glance as she ladled out beef stew and passed them all a plate. He helped himself to mashed potato and cabbage, both grown in the garden and tucked in with relish. You say that every evening, Mary chuckled. Because it's true. Saul smiled at the easy back and forth between his parents. They had the sort of loving relationship he longed for, and his thoughts turned to Eliza again, as they did almost every hour. "Are you daydreaming about Eliza?" Thomas muttered, nudging his brother with his elbow. "You always get a faraway look in your eye. Ain't it about time you proposed?" Saul hesitated, chewing his food thoughtfully. "I was wondering if it would be better to wait until we've sorted out splitting the ranch up. What do you think?" Blanche shot Thomas a pointed look. "Now that you bring up that subject, Saul, Thomas and I have been talking about the matter. We think that Thomas should be the rightful owner of the new log cabin on Landelle Ranch, don't we, dear?" She looked again at her husband, waiting for him to nod his agreement. "I thought you were staying in the old homestead?" Mary replied, looking puzzled. "We thought Saul would build a new cabin on that lovely hilltop, just yonder." "But Thomas is the eldest son," Blanche argued. "He should get the best of everything." 2 pink spots appeared on her cheeks, and there was a stubborn set to her mouth. Thomas and Saul have always managed to make decisions in a considerate way in the past. I'm sure they can come to an amicable agreement that suits them both this time as well. Mary gave David a worried look. She had noticed Blanche seemed dissatisfied with things lately, and the last thing she wanted was a rift between her 2 sons. "Do you think it's right to give the new cabin to Saul and let his older brother take the old one?" "That wouldn't be very fair, would it?" Blanche asked her parents-in-law. "And what about my opinion? I'm Thomas's wife, so surely I should have some say in the matter." She placed her hand over Thomas's and squeezed it. "Thomas says it's time for us to take over the reins now, and I support him fully, but we have to be given the priority if this is going to work." Before Thomas could respond, his father David asked, "Have you connived with your wife to take the best of everything in this division of the ranch and give your brother the leftovers, just because he's unmarried?" "He will be married soon," Mary interjected. "I've seen how happy Eliza's letters make him, so why shouldn't Saul have a wife?" Thomas cleared his throat, looking apologetic. "I think Saul and I can resolve this without any arguments. We know your wishes, Pa, and there's no need for us to fall out." Blanche frowned, not happy with being dismissed so lightly. "But you should let your parents know that as their first son, we should have the best spot on the ranch, Thomas," she insisted. Without waiting for an answer, Blanche stood up and flounced out of the kitchen. "I have a headache. I'm going to lie down," she called back to them. "Don't worry, Ma. I'm sure Blanche will realize that there's no fear of one of us having less than the other. We have to remember that she's not used to being part of a family business like ours." Thomas hurried after his wife, looking troubled. The following morning, Mary intercepted Saul as he was carrying a sack of corn to the chickens. "Your pa and I barely slept last night after the conversation at the dinner table. Tell me what your thoughts are, Saul. I want to know." "It's nothing, Ma. Just Blanche finding her feet like Thomas explained," Saul said, dismissing the matter. "We didn't like the tone that Blanche took, son. Your pa wasn't happy with what Blanche suggested, and you shouldn't be either," Mary insisted. "It doesn't bother me one bit if Blanche and Thomas want to have the new log cabin for themselves. You know I'm easygoing about this sort of thing. I'm happy to fit in with what Thomas wants." Saul tipped some corn on the ground, and the hens came running over, flapping their wings and squawking loudly as they fought for the best spot. He was determined not to let Blanche's behavior drive a wedge between him and Thomas. Mary shook her head, still looking worried. "It's not Thomas who bothers me. It's Blanche. I don't want anything to happen between you and your brother. You have to keep loving him and remain friends, as you have always been. I will speak to him as well. He needs to tell Blanche to be more thoughtful about our family ways." "I'm sure you'll bring her around," Saul chuckled. He knew that his ma was good at keeping things harmonious. It was why his parents' marriage was so strong, and he hoped he would have the same in his marriage one day. Mary decided to let the matter drop. "You haven't talked to me about Eliza lately. How is she doing?" Saul smiled, but his laughter quickly disappeared as though he had remembered something that upset him. "Why the frown? Is there a problem?" Mary reached into the nesting boxes and took out some freshly laid eggs, placing them carefully in her apron pocket. Saul shrugged. We're still corresponding, but I'm not so sure I will make a good husband. Come on, don't say that. You will be a great husband and father, too. Are you having cold feet because you met her through the matrimonial times? It's not so unusual out west, Saul. Why don't you tell me a bit more about her? Have you asked her age and the things she likes? Yes, but not everything. I know she is 25 and lives in Boston. She is an orphan, and her only brother is in New York, and they're not close. He is busy with his own life. And what does she like and dislike? I want to know these things so that I can guide you. Saul's face lit up as he recalled what Eliza had written in her letters. She enjoys the simple pleasures of life. She likes going for a walk and watching the sunset, and she wants to have children. He smiled at Mary. You know I love children, too. I always hoped I'd have at least 2. I think she will be perfect for you. You both like the same things, and I know you already told me she's not afraid of hard work. Mary hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Maybe it's time to send your proposal, Saul. You should invite her to Fairville. Saul shook his head firmly. No, at least not now. If not now, when? She sounds kind, and I can see how happy her letters make you. What are you waiting for? Just because things haven't worked out in the past doesn't mean Eliza would be like those other women. We have only known each other for a few months, Ma. It's too early for an invitation. Don't you think so? Mary tucked her hand into the crook of Saul's elbow as they walked back to the cabin. Your pa proposed to me when we'd only known each other for a month, and look at us now, with so many happy years together. I think you should go ahead and invite Eliza to Fairville. No marriage is ever perfect, but I know you will see the best in her, and I hope she will be the kind-hearted woman you deserve. Saul nodded slowly. I will give it some thought, Ma. I don't want to rush into it and make a mistake. How do you feel when you receive one of her letters? Mary asked. She stopped and looked at him intently, watching his face brighten with happiness. It's the best day of the week, Saul admitted with a chuckle. I've read all her letters so many times I can practically quote them word for word. I think you know it's time then, son, don't you? There's no need for any more unnecessary delays. Send her some money for her fare in your next letter, and you will see that I am right. Mary hurried away, already thinking about how to prepare to welcome Eliza to their ranch. It was a welcome relief from worrying about how to quell the brewing tension caused by Blanche's selfish ideas. Saul thought about his ma's words for the rest of the day, turning them over in his mind, still feeling unsure of what to do. After he'd finished feeding all the stock, he saddled up his mare and galloped to the top of the ranch, enjoying the adrenaline pumping through his veins. It was where he liked to come when he needed to think, and he let his horse graze while he looked out at the panoramic view that he knew so well. Every tree and undulation of the land was part of him, and he loved the ranch with all his heart. But he wanted to share it with someone special now, too. He was tired of feeling lonesome and knew it was time for a change in his life. As the sun sank in the sky, turning it a majestic golden hue, he sat under the crooked tree at the top of the hill and came to a decision. He would take his ma's advice and stop procrastinating. He grinned and jumped up again, galvanized into action. He had a proposal to write, and if all went well, he would be welcoming a new bride-to-be into the Landelle family within a matter of weeks. Chapter 7. Boston, Massachusetts. Eliza bade goodbye to the women who walked home in the same direction as her and cast a nervous look over her shoulder. The final part of her journey always felt like the most perilous as she was alone. After Mr. Romano's proposal, she had been on tenterhooks, but when the knock at her door for her rent came at the end of that fateful week, she had been surprised to see a thin, unkempt man standing outside instead of Mr. Romano. He's been called away on business, the man had explained before she'd even had a chance to speak. His lips had lifted in the hint of a smile as he looked her up and down. He's asked me to keep an eye on you until his return. Wants to make sure you don't start any sort of dalliance with a young man, if you get my meaning? Eliza had nodded, not sure whether to be relieved or not. Do you know how long Mr. Romano will be away for? Can't rightly say, Miss Roberts. He'd held out his grimy hand, waiting for the money. Don't go getting any ideas that he's forgotten about his generous proposal. You're to go about your business as normal, and he'll wed you as soon as he can. The man gave a humorless chuckle. One thing I'll say about Mr. Romano is that he has good taste in women. You're almost as pretty as the last two. Over the following days, Eliza had felt a mixture of terror and elation. A few discreet inquiries with some of the other tenants had thrown up the possibility that he had been sent to prison, but everyone assured her that if that was the case, he would manage to pay for an early release and would be out again soon enough. But at least it gave her a bit of time to look at the option of becoming a mail-order bride. And for that, she was extremely grateful. As the weeks passed, she had come to look forward to Saul's letters from Oregon. At first, he had seemed so reserved, she wondered whether he was actually looking for love. The thought had crossed her mind that he had placed the advertisement in a half-hearted manner just to show someone that it had been done. But with each new letter, Eliza started to get a sense that Saul was thoughtful, not reserved, which appealed to her. Many of the girls at the mill liked gentlemen who were extravagant with their praise and who paraded them about town like peacocks. But Eliza was not like that. She wanted a husband who would see the beauty in a wonderful sunset, or who would be happy to sit by the fire with her on a cold winter's night. "You have a letter, Eliza." Mrs. Jackson waved at her from outside their tenement building. "The postboy left it with me. It's from Oregon," she added with a wide smile. "I wonder what news he has for you this time. I'm enjoying hearing all about Mr. Landell's life out west almost as much as you." They walked up the stairs together, and Eliza opened the letter. Mrs. Jackson had been so supportive, almost like a second mother to her, that it felt only natural to share some of Saul's news about Fairville and the ranch with her. She picked up the money and quickly scanned the letter, murmuring the words contained in it. "Dear Eliza, I know that we have only been corresponding for a few months, but I have enjoyed each and every letter from you, and it has been an honor that you would choose to tell me about your family and the life you lead in Boston. I was worried that you might find my return letters a little dull by comparison, but writing about our ranch has made me see it through new eyes, and I appreciate the interest you show in our animals and our rural ways. My parents have decided to step aside and allow me and my older brother Thomas to take work the land now. And it got me thinking that I would very much like to share all of this with a wife by my side and hopefully children of our own one day. I guess what I'm trying to say is, would you be my wife, Eliza? My ma is a great believer in the Lord, knowing when to bring two people together, and I think it was no coincidence that we ended up writing to each other. I have enclosed money for your train fare and other travel expenses, just as Mrs. Della from the matrimonial agency has advised. I'm looking forward to having you as part of our family, and Ma has already made up a room for you, so everything will be perfectly proper, and we can get married once you've gotten to know us and had a chance to settle in. Yours sincerely, Saul Landell. Oh, my dear, how romantic, Mrs. Jackson sighed, looking misty-eyed. You see, it's just what happened with my niece. I told you there were good men out west. Eliza couldn't stop smiling. Thank you, and I'm sorry I doubted you. And this money he sent for my tickets and meals is more than I'll need. He must be a generous man, which is good. Nobody wants to marry someone who is mean with money. You deserve someone who cherishes you, Eliza. This bodes well. Until now, Eliza hadn't really believed that a proposal for marriage would come, and she was suddenly struck with a worrying thought. What if he doesn't like me when we meet, Mrs. Jackson? He might find me too quiet or not strong enough to work on the ranch. A sudden clatter in the hallway below made her jump. What if Mr. Romano finds out and tries to stop me? Her mind swirled with all the reasons why her happy future might be snatched from her hands. Hush now, Eliza. Don't go looking for problems where there aren't any. I am certain Saul will like you and marry you. You are as beautiful and good-natured as any other woman around. In fact, he'll be fortunate to have you for his wife. Thank you, Mrs. Jackson. What could I have done without you? Eliza smiled at the thought of the liberating life that lay ahead as she returned to the empty solitude of her room. It was the first time since Nathan's passing that she could imagine her life changing for the better, and she heaved a sigh of relief at the thought of not having to hide from the odious Mr. Romano any longer. For a moment, she felt sad for the future she had always planned for with Nathan, but there was nothing that she could do to undo his death. Looking across at the tidy pile of Saul's letters, Eliza took a shaky breath and felt a sudden lightness in her heart. She had loved Nathan, but it wasn't to be, and now she had mourned him for long enough. She closed her eyes and said a short prayer for his lost soul. May you rest in peace, Nathan. Thank you for the happy times we had together, but now I must move on. Please think kindly of me, my dear, and I pray that the Lord will allow me to have a happy life in this new chapter. Her whispered prayer brought tears of sadness and happiness to her eyes, and she wiped them away. Mrs. Jackson had urged her not to linger in case Mr. Romano made an unwelcome reappearance, so Eliza made herself a quick cup of coffee, her mind already racing with everything she had to get done in the next few days. First, she would book her rail ticket and send a telegram telling Saul when to expect her, and then she would dismantle everything that had been her life until the point. It was a daunting prospect, and one that she wouldn't have dreamt of doing just a few short months ago. But with the Lord on her side, Eliza found courage within her that she never knew she possessed. 2 days later, she pulled her carpet bag out from the rickety closet before dawn and opened it, looking around at her few meager possessions. Saul had said in his previous letter that Fairville was a bustling frontier town with everything a person would need for a home and life on the ranch, so she decided it was best to travel with just what she needed. She eyed up her plates and pots, as well as the broom in the corner, deciding to give them to Mrs. Jackson. If everything worked according to plan, she was not expected to return to Boston, and her new husband would provide for her needs. It only took Eliza a few short hours to pack her bag and clean her room from top to bottom, so it was spick and span. It was still a few days until her next rent payment was due, so she hoped she wouldn't encounter anyone to do with Mr. Romano until she had safely gotten away. "Are you ready, dear?" Mrs. Jackson knocked gently and let herself in. Eliza nodded. "I think so. The train leaves in a couple of hours, which will give me time to tender my resignation at the mill on the way to the station." She gestured at her carpet bag and reticule. "It's not much to show for my life, is it?" Suddenly, she was filled with doubts again, and her brow furrowed. "You're bound to feel nervous, Eliza, and your life is worth far more than what's in your bag, you know. You have been a kind and thoughtful neighbor and friend to us, and we will all miss you." Mrs. Jackson enveloped her in a hug before standing back again. She pulled a package out of her apron. "This is so you don't forget about us. Will you write and tell me all about it?" Eliza opened the parcel, which contained a knitted scarf, and her eyes pooled with tears. "Thank you. You remembered that Saul said the winters could be bitterly cold." She slipped the gift into the top of her bag and fastened the leather straps. "I promise I will write as soon as I've settled in, and you must keep me abreast of all your news as well. You have been a very dear friend. Come along, then. You don't want to miss your train." Mrs. Jackson dried her eyes and chuckled. "Maybe we'll come out and join you one day if Mr. Romano keeps putting the rent up." They hugged again, both knowing it would be the last time they would ever see one another. "Thank you again," Eliza said. She gathered up her belongings and gave her friend a shaky smile. "No more tears, my dear. This is a happy day for you. Your parents would be very proud of how bravely you have risen to all these challenges." Mrs. Jackson shooed her down the stairs and stood at the window to watch her go. Eliza set off down the street for a little way before turning around to look back at the dilapidated building one last time. She was hit with a wave of nostalgia. It was the place she had called home for many years, and it hadn't all been bad. There had been laughter there as well as friendships. "Thank you for every part of my life in Boston, Lord. In your mercy, please look after me on this journey west and give your blessings on my friend, Mrs. Jackson." She whispered the words and raised her hand to wave before turning the corner and leaving her old home forever. If Eliza had expected Mr. Carden to thank her for her years of hard work at the mill, she would have been disappointed. He took her letter of resignation, pocketing it without even reading it. "I should have known you would leave," he sniffed. "I suppose you think you'll find happiness out west like so many other poor, deluded women." Eliza bit back the retort that was on the tip of her tongue. "Good day to you, Mr. Carden. Thank you for your time." She picked up her back and walked out of the mill with her head held high, even though his words of doubt were still ringing in her ears. "I will find happiness with Saul," she muttered, determined to prove him wrong. As she hurried toward the station, she felt her worries return. Boston was all she'd ever known, and she wondered what the people of Fairville were like and how they would receive her. Although she had tried to live how her ma had brought her up, with polite manners and kindness, things might be very different in a rural community. It hadn't even occurred to her that Saul and his family might be in a higher social class than she was. "Don't find problems where there aren't any," she reminded herself, echoing what Mrs. Jackson had said to her. She quickened her step as she saw the station come into view. If she missed the train, she would have to wait another 3 days to catch the next one, which was the last thing she wanted. As she got closer, she saw a throng of people heading toward the small building that served as the train managers' and ticketing agents' offices. All aboard. The station manager strode up and down the platform with his flag at the ready. "You're in that carriage, ma'am," he said as Eliza showed him her ticket. She squeezed through the narrow, crowded aisle in the carriage, past noisy families and folks returning west after coming to Boston for trading. There were boxes and baskets full to the brim with every imaginable item, and by the time she got to her seat, she was more than ready to sit down and close her eyes for a few moments to gather her thoughts. Finally, with a long blast of its horn, the train brakes were released, and the steam belched from the engine, filling the vaulted roof. They were off. Eliza let out a long sigh, only then realizing how tense and anxious she had been feeling, imagining that some disaster would halt her journey before it had even started. "It's nice to know we're leaving, ain't it?" A cheerful woman opposite her gave Eliza an understanding grin. "I ain't sorry to see the back of Boston, that's for sure. Neither are most of the women in this carriage, I'll wager." "I think I have to agree with you," Eliza said with a surge of happiness. She watched as the building slipped by, turning from houses to storage sheds, and then the open countryside, feeling like a snake shedding its skin. In a little over a week, she would be in Fairville, ready to start her new life. The thought made her smile, and before long, the steady chugging of the train had lulled her to sleep. Chapter 8. Fairville, Oregon. Eliza jerked awake as the train lurched sideways on a bumpy part of the railroad track. She turned to look out of the window, rubbing her eyes and yawning. The vast flat plains had changed to rolling hills with mountains beyond, and she wondered how much further there was to go. "Sorry about that, folks." The conductor tipped his hat with a grin. "Sometimes the track out here can get a little bent up, but we'll get you there in one piece." "Are we almost there?" An exhausted-looking woman with 4 children gave him a beseeching look. "We sure are, ma'am. We'll be in Fairville before you know it." He gave the children a mint humbug each, and the woman thanked him profusely. Eliza stretched her legs out underneath her petticoats. The journey had felt interminable, and her gown was dusty and crumpled from being cooped up in their carriage. The only resting spots had turned out to be sparsely populated outposts, and as she caught sight of her blurred reflection in the window, she wished she would have had a chance to freshen up. "You don't look anywhere near as bad as me," the woman with the children said, giving her a smile. "I feel exhausted, but you still look as fresh as a daisy. I hope your beau thinks so too," she added with a wink. Eliza had learned that most of the women in her carriage were coming west to be mail-order brides, which had done a lot to alleviate her worries. But as the crowded carriage thinned, with women getting off at various spots along the way to meet their future husbands, her doubts returned. What if Saul was not better than Mr. Romano? What if she didn't like him? Or worse, what if he took one look at her and declared their relationship to be over? By the time the train screeched to a halt, her heart was racing. She clutched her carpet bag like some sort of shield, telling herself that if it all came to nothing, she would just have to find work and hope for the best. "Good luck, ma'am." The conductor tipped his hat as he handed her down onto the platform. "I reckon you're going to like it here. Fairville is a quaint little town, good for raising a family." The train was only making the briefest of stops, and she stood on the platform, watching it pull away with a sense of trepidation. It was the only link to her past, and as it gathered speed, she felt a tug of homesickness. Everything that lay ahead of her was new and uncharted, and she wondered how she would cope. "Eliza Roberts?" The low voice behind her sounded warm, but also slightly hesitant. She turned around, already preparing herself not to expect too much. "Mr. Landelle?" Her question came out in a surprised whisper as she gazed up at the handsome man standing before her. He had already removed his hat to reveal curly brown hair, and there were fine lines radiating from the corners of his blue eyes. His broad shoulders and strong chest showed that he was well accustomed to hard physical labor, and his face and neck were tanned above his shirt collar from spending most of his time outside. "I'm Saul Landell," he replied, reaching forward and shaking her hand in a rather formal manner. Eliza resisted the urge to curtsy and hastily found her tongue again. "I'm Eliza Roberts. Pleased to meet you." Saul's eyes filled with relief, and she realized that he was just as nervous as she was. "Is this your only bag, or do you have a trunk as well?" He looked past her at the platform, which was now almost empty. "This is all I have." Eliza felt momentarily embarrassed about how poor it must make her look to have all her worldly possessions in one small bag. "I like that about you," Saul said with a sudden smile that lit up his rugged features. "A woman who can travel light is very sure of herself, I believe. Not like the sort of person who requires a dozen gowns and matching trinkets to put on a false front to the world." He took the bag from her and swung it over one shoulder as though it was lighter than air, then gestured to the exit. "My cart is through there, Miss Roberts. Let me help you up." "I apologize for being so dusty and travel-worn," she gabbled nervously. "I thought I would have time to freshen up, but the places we stopped had no such luxuries." His mouth curved up in a rueful smile. "You'll soon see me in a much worse state after a day working in the fields. You look far lovelier than I'll ever be, even when I'm scrubbed up for church." Eliza felt the flush rise up her cheeks at his comment, and her heart skipped a beat. It had been a very long time since anyone had said anything so complimentary. "Thank you, Mr. Landell." "Please, call me Saul," he invited. "Thank you, Saul, and you must call me Eliza. I'm not used to such formalities." She patted her hair, attempting to tuck a few stray strands back into the hairpins that held her curls in place. The warm breeze pulled her hair loose again, and it fell softly around her face. "You don't need to worry about your hair either," Saul said. "I mean, Ma has set your room up at home with everything you need," he added hastily, in case she took his words the wrong way. A moment later, Saul helped her climb up onto the wooden seat of the wagon before settling himself next to her. He picked up the reins and clicked his tongue, urging the horse into a trot. As Eliza gazed intently at everything that Fairville had to offer, he took the opportunity to look at this woman who had left everything to travel west and marry him. Her auburn hair looked like burnished copper, glinting in the sun where her bonnet didn't cover it, and her eyes were a shade of greenish blue that reminded him of the surface of the lake at home. She was prettier than he had expected or hoped for, and he couldn't help but feel a surge of pride as he saw the townsfolk turning to watch them pass. "You seem to know everyone," Eliza commented as several different people waved at them. "It's a small community, even though it's growing bigger each year." Saul tipped his hat at an elderly couple on the sidewalk who smiled as their wagon bowled past. "Don't take their curiosity the wrong way, though. Most everyone is friendly." He knew that word would soon get around that the second of the Landell brothers was looking to take a bride, especially as he caught sight of Mrs. Raleigh, the town gossip, staring open-mouthed from her rocking chair outside the tea room that she ran. "I didn't imagine there would be so much here." Eliza took in the many different businesses and shops, There were several mercantile stores, the sheriff's office, hotels and boarding houses, saloons on almost every corner, and a scattering of tea shops, even several dressmakers. And that didn't include the bigger businesses that required warehouses on the outskirts of town. Saul nodded. It's certainly changed a lot since I was a boy. We have a new park over yonder by the river and several churches. His face clouded with worry. I hope you won't find it too quiet on the ranch. I try and come into town for church most weeks and to get supplies for Ma, of course. But when we're busy with the harvest and such, we don't come in so often. Oh no, it will make a welcome change to be somewhere quiet, Eliza said, wanting to reassure him. Where I used to live, there was always noise. Drunkards coming home from the saloon, children crying, even the sound of carriages out on the street. And at work, the looms were so noisy, some of the older workers were almost made deaf. She blushed again, wondering if she was being talkative, but Saul just nodded, enjoying hearing about Boston. You're more likely to hear the owls hooting at night back home, he said with a chuckle. And Maisie, my dog, barks if she hears something that bothers her. Other than that, it's pretty quiet. But not boring, Eliza replied, referring back to something he had written in one of his letters. I know you were worried that I might find country life strange, but I'm eager to learn all about what you do on the ranch. My parents used to take us for a day out into the countryside every summer when I was a little girl, and I always used to wish we could stay there forever. Saul felt his heart lift with happiness. From what he had seen of Eliza so far, she seemed very different from Blanche, who had taken to complaining about how hard life was at the ranch lately. Despite Eliza's weariness from her journey, it didn't hide the healthy glow of her cheeks. She was slightly taller than he had imagined, with the top of her head coming just above his shoulder, and she had a lithe but shapely figure. She looked to be the sort of woman who was not afraid of hard work, and the inquisitive tilt of her head confirmed that, just as she had said, she wanted to learn everything about her new surroundings. It was a huge relief to know that he hadn't gotten a dainty lady who would turn her nose up at their rural ways. At least that was what he hoped. Soon, they were beyond the town's boundary, and the wagon bowled along at a brisk lick, eating up the distance between Fairville and the ranch. Eliza imagined all the years ahead that they would make this journey together. For church, to visit new friends, maybe even to take their children to school one day. She stole a glance at Saul, admiring the firm line of his jaw and the confident way he handled the reins. Every time he spoke, the horse's ears flicked in their direction, and she could already tell that he had a way with animals that was based on respect instead of fear. As if reading her mind, Saul turned his head and pointed to a small building, smiling at her. That's where some of the ranch children go to school if it's too far to head into town. Eliza blushed. They hadn't talked directly about children in their letters, other than to both say they would like a family. Before she could reply, the horse turned off the road, making the wagon bounce over the rocky track they were now on. This is it, Saul declared. Summit Lake Ranch, although everyone just calls it the Landelle's place. My family is looking forward to meeting you. Chapter 9. Eliza had spent many long hours on her journey imagining her arrival at the ranch. In her mind's eye, she had pictured a small log cabin with the family all standing on the veranda watching as the wagon arrived, curious to see who Saul had been writing to. She had prepared her greetings in her head so that she wouldn't stumble over her words out of nerves. But her arrival did not go at all how she had envisioned. As the wagon rumbled toward the homestead, she was amazed to see a long, low cabin that was at least double the size she had thought it would be from Saul's letters, and the surrounding barns and corrals looked tidy and well kept. It was clear to see that the family took great pride in their work. "This looks wonderful, Saul," Eliza exclaimed. She turned her head, taking in the grazing cattle and lush paddocks with the mountains rearing majestically as the backdrop. A lake sat at the center of the view, and it sparkled as the sunlight caught the ripples on its surface. "This is the most beautiful place I have ever seen. No wonder you spoke so fondly of it in your letters. It looks so homey. I don't think I'd care if we only went to town once a month when you have all of this." Saul smiled broadly, feeling like he'd won first prize at the summer fair. It was the response he had been hoping for, but he hadn't dared assume that Eliza would feel the same sense of belonging that he did. "It's mostly down to Ma and Pa's hard work when we were growing up," he said modestly. "I'm sure glad you appreciate the beauty of the place. Wait until you've been here for a whole year. You'll love it even more. Every season, there's something new to see." He jumped down from the wagon and hitched the reins to a post before hurrying around to Eliza's side to help her down. "Ma and Pa will be out any moment." Eliza looked expectantly toward the cabin, but no sooner had the words left Saul's mouth than the main door at the front of the cabin flew open, and a small, blonde-haired woman stormed across the veranda, running down the steps with tears streaming down her cheeks, swiftly followed by a tall man who could only be Saul's brother, Thomas, given how similar their features were. "Blanche, come back. They didn't mean anything by it." Thomas caught up with his wife, and she spun round to face him. "Why must they pour scorn on my ideas all the time, Thomas? Do they not even realize how hard it was for me to leave everything behind and come to this, back of beyond?" Blanche gestured wildly at the land and buildings surrounding them, her voice rising with agitation. "I only said I wanted our new cabin to be big enough for all our children, and your pa laughed and said the size of the old one had been perfectly good enough for him and your ma to raise a family." Thomas folded Blanche into an embrace, rubbing her back as the tears gradually subsided into muffled sniffs against his chest. "You're the oldest, Thomas, and I'm your wife. We should be afforded more respect. I don't even want to think about what it's going to be like when she arrives." Saul's expression hardened, and he coughed loudly, making Thomas and Blanche look in their direction. He looked up at Eliza, whose smile had frozen on her face. "Blanche can be a bit temperamental," he muttered. "I'm sorry, this wasn't quite the welcome Ma had planned for you." Blanche wiped her tears quickly with the back of her hand, and Thomas had the good grace to look slightly apologetic. Neither of them had noticed the wagon in the emotion of the moment. "We weren't expecting you back from town so soon, Saul. Aren't you going to introduce us?" He strolled over, suddenly all smiles, with his arm around Blanche's waist. Saul helped Eliza down from the wagon, and Maisie came darting down the steps, barking with excitement and wagging her tail, breaking the moment of tension. "Eliza, this is my brother, Thomas, and his wife, Blanche, and my collie, Maisie," he added with a chuckle as the dog sat on her haunches and yapped again. "It's very nice to meet you," Eliza said shyly. "Saul, you're back already, and this must be Eliza." A gray-haired woman appeared in the doorway, followed by a stooped gentleman who used a cane and walked with a noticeable limp. "Welcome to the ranch, my dear. I expect you must be exhausted. Come on and let me show you to your room so you can freshen up." Mary Landelle bustled toward her with the same twinkling blue eyes as her son's. She tucked Eliza's hand into her arm and steered her toward the cabin, where David was waiting to shake hands with her. "Thank you. You're very kind," Eliza stuttered. "Don't overwhelm the poor woman, Ma," Thomas said good-naturedly as he started to unhitch the wagon for Saul. "Remember how strange Blanche found it when she arrived? I expect Eliza might be feeling the same, too." Mary waved her hand, dismissing Thomas's comment. "Saul, if you could take Eliza's bag through to her bedroom, please. Blanche, could you fetch a towel from the laundry press?" She gave Eliza a welcoming smile. "There's hot water ready by your washstand to freshen up, and you can have a bath later if you'd like." "We're so happy to have you here. I've been thinking about nothing else since Saul sent his proposal." Blanche nodded as she pulled a towel out for her. "I'm sorry if you saw that little squabble," she whispered. "I came as a mail-order bride last fall, and I'm still finding my place. But don't worry, I'll be able to help you settle in." She glanced over her shoulder, making sure Mary was out of earshot. "I think it's hard for her, seeing a younger woman in the house," she muttered. "Of course, she thinks Saul can do no wrong because he's the youngest son, but really it's Thomas who does all the hard work. I'm sure we'll all get along perfectly once the place has been split up properly, the way it should be." Without enlarging on what she meant, Blanche smiled and hurried away, leaving Eliza wondering whether she had imagined the tearful outburst just a few short minutes ago. Although Eliza was tired from her journey, she took time to look around the room that Mary had given her. It was about the same size as her room in Mr. Romano's squalid building, but there the similarity ended. The comfortable bed was draped with a patchwork quilt, and there was a colorful rug next to the bed, which she already knew would be soft on her feet on a cold morning getting out of bed. The washstand contained a floral-patterned bowl with a large jug next to it full of warm water, and there was a fluffy flannel for her to bathe her face. As well as drawers for her clothes, an armchair by the window completed the room, flanked by a table that would be perfect for her Bible and sewing box. The view through the window made Eliza pause and smile with appreciation. It looked out on the horses which were trotting along the fence with the lake beyond. Her eyes pooled with tears as she realized how much care had gone into making her welcome. She couldn't remember anyone being so kind other than Mrs. Jackson since her parents had died. Thank you, Lord, for bringing me safely to the Landelle's ranch and this family. Eliza knew that God's hand could only have made this happen. It was so unexpectedly wonderful. She could barely wait to write to Mrs. Jackson to thank her for suggesting this path. Her old friend had given her guidance at such critical moments of her life. She had been like a gift from heaven for her, always there to console and lift her spirits. If not for Mrs. Jackson, Eliza wouldn't even be in Fairville. She realized that all her thoughts had been on getting to know Saul and their marriage, but she would also be gaining a whole new family as well. Her first impression was that Mary had a sweet personality. She already liked her, and she hoped they would have a good relationship. She remembered how Saul described Mary in one of the letters to her. He had said, "My mother is the center of the Landelle family. Even though Pa calls the shots, it's Ma who ensures everything works out as planned." Eliza had overheard several women on the train journey lamenting the fact that their prospective mother-in-law wielded all the power, which was a reason to dislike them. But having lost her ma to typhoid, Eliza didn't see it that way. She hoped that Mary might fill that void in her heart and take on a motherly role in her life. But she could already sense that Blanche chafed against Mary's role as the matriarch of the family. "I will have to be careful not to take sides and try and keep in everyone's good books." The thought made her slightly worried, but she pushed it aside, determined not to find problems in her new life. An hour later, there was a tap at her door, and it opened quietly. "Did you fall asleep, dear?" Mary's head poked around, and Eliza nodded guiltily. Her Bible was still open in her lap, where she had been reading it. "I'm sorry, I just sat down to have a quiet moment and give thanks and must have nodded off. The chair was so comfortable after those hard seats on the train. We're going to have dinner now. Will you join us?" Eliza jumped up, suddenly feeling nervous again. The idea of a family dinner felt daunting. She realized that the last time she had experienced one was when her parents were alive, many years ago. Although Eliza often said that she had become used to her loneliness, it was all a lie, because many times she had wished for the company of friends and family during the long evenings alone in her room. She smoothed her hair and followed Mary to the main living room, where all the members of the Landelle family were already gathered, waiting for her, hoping that she was ready for what lay ahead. "I've laid a place for you next to Saul," Mary said, giving her a coy smile. "I know some folks get married the moment they step off the train, but I think it's wise to have a little while to get accustomed to each other, don't you?" Eliza slid into her seat and glanced at Saul before nodding. "I already told her that, Ma," Saul said lightly, including Eliza in his smile. "I reckon it takes a lot of courage to do what you and Blanche have done, coming out west, so I figured we could go into town in a couple of weeks and see about booking the pastor then if that suits you." "That sounds perfect." Eliza folded her hands and bowed her head as David said a brief prayer, and then Mary served the food. "This looks delicious, Mrs. Landelle, and so plentiful." She could scarcely believe that there were 2 dishes of vegetables to go with the meat, as well as cornbread. "We might not have all the conveniences of a big town like Boston, but we don't go short of good food," David said jovially. "Home-raised beef, the best in the district, and homegrown vegetables. Mind you, Mary finds the gardening hard work these days. His words hung in the air, and he gave Blanche a pointed look. Maybe you could teach me? Eliza said, jumping straight in, wanting to make a good impression. She realized suddenly how forward it sounded. I mean, if that's okay. I've never tended a garden before, but I'd like to learn. Unless it's what you prefer to do, Blanche? Blanche frowned and shook her head. The garden has always been Mary's domain, so I don't like to interfere, just like Thomas and Saul know the most about the animals. The rest of the meal passed pleasantly, with talk mainly about the cattle and how well the hay harvest had gone. Eliza couldn't help but notice that Blanche was quiet, and her expression hardened every time David and Mary asked Saul for his opinion about something, even though they asked for Thomas's advice as well. There was an undercurrent of tension that left her feeling unsettled, but she wasn't sure what it was about. "Why don't you take Eliza for a walk to the lake, son?" Mary said as soon as they had finished the fruit pie Blanche had cooked for dessert. "Blanche will help me clean the dishes." "Are you sure?" Eliza felt a pang of guilt. "I want to make sure I do my share of the chores." "Don't worry about that. You'll be working hard soon enough," Blanche muttered. She tossed her head and started gathering up the plates, taking them to the side. "Blanche is right. We all have our different roles. It's the only way a busy ranch like this can survive," David commented, seemingly unperturbed by Blanche's sour mood. "I don't mind at all. I used to work 12 hours a day at the mill, so I like to keep busy. I expect you're tired from your journey, so enjoy the evening to yourselves. I can show you the garden and go through all the homestead chores with you tomorrow, dear." Mary shooed Eliza and Saul out of the kitchen, watching as they set off toward the lake with a happy sigh. She had worried that Saul might never find a wife, but from what she had seen of Eliza so far, they seemed well suited. "When are you going into town for fencing materials, Thomas?" Blanche's eyes glinted with determination, and she stood with her hands on her hips. "I'm sure there's no reason to wait for their wedding to get started on dividing the land, is there?" Thomas shrugged nonchalantly in his usual easygoing way. "I need to ask Saul when he'll have time to help me. It's more than I can do alone." "Surely the neighbors can help if Saul is too wrapped up in his own affairs?" Blanche didn't want to let the matter drop, and she gave her husband a firm look. "We need to get it built before winter, Thomas. The hay is in, so why don't we go into town tomorrow, and we can call on the Robinsons on the way? I asked Jared Robinson last time I saw him, and he said his ranch hands would help us out." "You spoke to Jared Robinson?" David scowled as he struggled to his feet. "I don't think you should be meddling like that, Blanche. It's up to Thomas and Saul to put the new fence up and decide on when to build the new log cabin. That's how things are done around here." "It's all right, Pa. I'm sure Blanche was only trying to help." Thomas rushed to his wife's defense. "If Saul and I can't manage, I'll definitely think about asking for Jared's help." Mary sighed as David turned his back on his daughter-in-law and hobbled away to his study. She could tell by the set of his shoulders that he was offended by Blanche's manner and wondered how she could smooth things over. "Your fruit pie was delicious tonight, Blanche," she said hastily. She glanced at Thomas, who was pulling on his boots to go out and check the stock. "I know it might take us all a little while to get used to Eliza joining us, but we must make her feel welcome." "Of course we will, Ma." Thomas squeezed his mother's shoulder and picked up his hat. "Anyway, everything will be easier once we have our new log cabin," Blanche added sweetly. "It's better than all living on top of each other, and Eliza will be able to tend to the garden to her heart's content." She hummed quietly as she finished washing the dishes, already daydreaming about how she and Thomas would be able to get the best view from their new veranda once they were living at the top of the hill. Chapter 10. You're doing a great job there. Saul leaned his elbows on the top rail of the fence and watched Eliza, who was busy milking their dairy cow, Bluebell. She pushed a lock of hair back from her face and grinned up at him from the three-legged stool she was perched on, next to the cow's flank. "If Mr. Carden could see me now, I think he'd probably be lost for words. You're a natural with all the animals. His loss is definitely our gain." Saul vaulted over the fence and strolled over to scratch the cow's neck. The sun had not long risen, and the morning air was crisp, hinting at the change of season just around the corner. Eliza turned pink at the compliment, still pulling rhythmically under the cow's udder. The scent of warm, fresh milk filling the bucket by her feet was becoming more familiar to her now that she had been at the ranch for almost 2 weeks. It's kind of you to say so, but I still feel as though I don't know much about anything. The bucket was almost full, and she gave a couple more tugs on the teats before standing up slowly, being careful not to frighten the cow with any sudden movements. Nope, that ain't true. Besides, you're a quick learner. Saul lifted the bucket up to save Eliza's back. Bluebell wouldn't give you so much milk if she didn't like you, so I'm not just saying it to be kind. It's because you have a calm way about you. The animals notice it, you see. Eliza tipped her head inquisitively, always eager to pick up more knowledge. They notice? I'm just being careful, I guess. I'd hate to frighten one of them. You'd be surprised how much animals can tell about people. Some folks think they're just dumb creatures, but if you're feeling angry or upset, they pick up on it. Or if you're too hesitant and nervous, it makes them twitchy too. Blanche doesn't enjoy being around the horses because they get skittish. I tried to tell her it's because she's scared of them and she needs to take the lead, but she didn't like hearing it. Eliza wasn't sure what to say. Blanche had been cool and distant with her since her arrival, but it felt wrong to be talking about her behind her back. I suppose it's because she came from New York. When you live in a big town, there's not much chance to learn how to behave around animals. Maybe it's because I was used to trying not to be the butt of Mr. Carden's anger at the mill that I learned to keep my emotions in check. Saul stared at her and scratched his head. You know what? I hadn't thought of it that way. He smiled slowly, and the skin by his eyes crinkled in a way that Eliza found endearing. I know Blanche hasn't been very friendly, but you still try and see the best in her. You have a kind heart, Eliza, and I should take a leaf out of your book, although she does try my patience when she spooks the cattle, waving her arms around and hollering, getting them all stirred up. Eliza chuckled at the image. You forget. You and Thomas have been doing this since you were knee-high to a bumblebee. It's all new for Blanche and me. They fell into step together as Saul carried the bucket of milk over to the shed that housed the butter churn. Once a week, Mary made butter and cheese, and she had promised to show Eliza how it was done later that morning. The muslin cloths were already being boiled in readiness, and Saul draped a tea towel over the top of the bucket to keep the flies out of the milk. I see Ma's had you picking oranges already. There was a basket of the juicy, ripe fruits on the veranda that caught Saul's eye. He suddenly turned to Eliza, looking bashful. I hope you don't mind that we don't get to spend much time together. I'd hoped I could show you the top of the ranch and the wildflower meadows up by the mountains, but Thomas has gotten it into his head that we have to get the ranch split as soon as possible. She bit her lip, looking momentarily troubled. I know you must do what you need. I was just worried that my arrival has caused some sort of rift. Her eyes clouded with an uncertainty that evoked a new feeling in Saul. He wanted to protect her. No, it's not you, Eliza. You mustn't think that. She smiled with relief. The soft rays of the sun through the door caught her green eyes, making them look so beautiful that he couldn't stop himself from reaching out to stroke her cheek. When she didn't pull away, he bent his head closer and brushed the lightest of kisses where his thumb had just been. He wanted to kiss her rosy lips, but it felt too presumptuous. After a beat of time passed, he forced himself to draw back. It's just to do with Pa's wish to divide the ranch is all. I don't want to trouble you with all that nonsense when you've only just arrived. I expect you'd rather think about the wedding. Eliza gave him a small smile and placed her hand on his arm. You can share everything with me, Saul. I'd like to know. Maybe there's something I can do to help make things easier. He shook his head quickly, thinking how so much of the tension was caused by Blanche's interference. His pa always said that things like that were best left to the men. Even though he wanted to confide in Eliza, it was a hard habit to break, and he was afraid that if Eliza got involved, it might somehow cause an even deeper rift. It's fine. It'll blow over. Eliza's hand was still resting on his arm, and he could feel the heat of it through the cotton of his shirt sleeve. Her gentle touch roused his senses so much that he almost missed her next comment. I wondered if Blanche and Thomas are unhappy about us getting married. I don't want to be the cause of any upset at the ranch, Saul, especially if it makes things difficult for your parents. Are you sure us getting wed is the right thing to do? Saul jerked his arm away, shocked by her suggestion. Thomas would never think such a thing, and Ma is over the moon. But what about your pa? I noticed that sometimes he looks a bit annoyed when Mary is sharing out the chores between Blanche and me. Did I do something wrong? See, this is what happens when the wives don't understand our ways. Saul wished he could snatch his words back as soon as he saw the hurt in Eliza's eyes at his rebuff. His irritation was with Blanche, not Eliza. But he had tarred them with the same brush and knew that a clumsy apology would probably only make it worse. He decided to change the subject instead. I have to go into town next week. I'll take you with me, and we can go speak with the preacher about marrying us. He saw happiness flare on her face before a more guarded expression took its place. I know we said we'd marry after a few weeks, but now I'm thinking we should wait a while longer. Her sudden change of heart shocked Saul, and he crossed his arms. Wait, what for? I've heard your ma and pa talking about how they want the ranch split between you and Thomas, and I overheard Blanche saying it's not happening in a fair way. I got the feeling it was something to do with us getting married, but... Saul cut her off with a sharp shake of his head. It's nothing to do with her. This is for me and Thomas to figure out, but I don't see what it's got to do with us marrying. Eliza sighed. I don't want people keeping secrets from me, Saul. I want to be a proper help to you and support you however I can. But if you can't speak to me about such things, what does that say about our future? She gave him a tentative smile, but he stubbornly refused to meet her eyes. I appreciate you might be doing it to spare me from getting entangled in bad feelings with Blanche, but I don't want you to shield me as though I'm too delicate or wouldn't understand. That's not the kind of marriage I hope for us to have. I know, Saul started. He wanted to tell her how Blanche had changed beyond recognition since his pa had decided to split the land between Thomas and him, but he didn't know how, without it spoiling the blossoming feelings he had for Eliza. Over the last few days, he had noticed that Thomas was siding more and more with Blanche, and yesterday he had come right out and said that she was right. As the eldest, he should get the lion's share. They had exchanged sharp words the night before, but Thomas's parting shot had shocked him to his core. Pa mollycoddles you, Saul, and Ma thinks you can do no wrong. It ain't right that you and Eliza should get the best spot on the ranch for your nice new log cabin, leaving us down here. You should give me more respect and count yourself lucky I'm letting you have a share at all. I could have said you just work for me and have done with it. Pa will be gone soon. Blanche says I'm too soft on you, and I'm coming round to thinking she's right. Seeing the way Blanche wanted the best of everything and trampled roughshod over his parents' feelings had planted a seed of fear deep in his heart that Eliza might change and become sullen and ungrateful as well. He knew it was irrational, but he figured that if he kept Eliza out of it, the whole thing might resolve itself, and his family could go back to being happy again. Won't you let me help? Eliza tried again, hoping to rekindle the closeness between them a moment ago. It's best left, he said bluntly. I don't want to talk about it anymore. I've got to get on with my jobs now. Saul strode across the yard without giving her a chance to reply, and Eliza watched him go, feeling defeated. It was almost too much to bear thinking about, but if Saul wouldn't talk to her about his troubles, there was no point going ahead with the wedding. She wanted them to be like David and Mary, who she could see had an unshakable bond. Even though every part of her yearned to be Saul's wife, she knew that she would never be truly happy if she and her husband could only share superficial happiness instead of having the closeness to share their troubles and sorrows as well. She touched her cheek, tracing where his lips had just kissed her, and then shook her head, wondering whether that might be the first and last kiss she would ever receive from the man she had fallen in love with. Chapter 11. The following afternoon, shortly after lunch, Mary called Eliza over to the veranda. She had been busy weeding in the vegetable garden and was glad for a chance to sit in the shade for a few minutes. "You don't have to work so hard, dear," Mary said with a ready smile. She poured 2 glasses of lemonade and passed one across the table. "I know you might feel as though you have something to prove, but as long as the chores are done, it doesn't harm to rest and enjoy the view now and again." "It certainly is very lovely here, Mary." Eliza sipped her drink and relaxed back in her chair, letting her gaze drift to where the horses were standing under the maple trees, gently swishing their tails. The busy streets of Boston and the dreadful noise in Flint Mill feel like a lifetime ago. Mary picked up her knitting, and they sat companionably as the needles clacked. "You've made a great effort to fit in, and I know a lot of what we do must feel strange," she said eventually. "I wouldn't say strange. I just hope I don't make any mistakes. I'd hate to think one of the animals got sick because of something I'd done, or the vegetables failed from lack of care." Eliza hesitated for a moment. "I want Saul to be pleased with my progress," she added quietly, almost to herself. "I was the same way when David and I first got married," Mary said with a wry smile. "I got up an hour earlier than I needed to, and I raced through my chores like a tornado until one day he said to me, 'Mary, if you don't calm down, I'm going to take you straight back to your ma and tell her I made a mistake. You're flightier than a mare on fresh spring grass.'" Mary chuckled again and shook her head at the memory. "He didn't mean it, of course. It was just his way of telling me that I didn't need to prove myself for him to love me. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?" Eliza nodded and took another sip of her drink. "I guess I have been overdoing it a bit," she admitted. "Saul is going to the far side of the ranch tonight to mend fences. There's a lovely meadow there with shelter to have a campfire and sleep out under the stars. How about I pack up some food and you go with him? It would give you a chance to see more of the ranch." "I'm not sure. Maybe Saul would rather go alone. I don't want to hold him up." Eliza felt her cheeks turning pink. Nonsense. He's already spent far too long in his own company. Mary levered herself out of her rocking chair and gave Eliza a mischievous smile. "David used to say it was the most romantic place on the ranch. In the spring, it's carpeted with wildflowers. Don't worry, I've raised my boys to behave like perfect gentlemen, so nothing improper will happen. And Saul told me you could use more practice learning to ride." "Did I hear my name?" Saul appeared in the doorway, wiping the dirt off his hands with an old rag. "I'm just going to pack up some food so you and Eliza can camp out in the top meadow tonight, and she can help you check the fences. Make sure you take a blanket for her in case it gets chilly." Mary bustled away before Saul could reply. "You don't mind, do you?" Eliza still felt unsure of where they stood after the previous day, but Saul smiled broadly. She liked that he wasn't a man who stayed stuck in a bad mood. "There's no stopping Ma once she gets an idea in her head. It's a lovely spot, and I have been meaning to take you up there. It's the farthest part of the ranch, so I often camp out when I'm working up there." Eliza's muscles ached, but in a good way. The ride took a good hour because they had gone slowly, checking the animals and fences on their way. Saul was a thoughtful teacher. The first time Eliza had sat on his mare, she was convinced she would be flat on her back in the dirt a second later, but she was a patient horse and tolerated Eliza's inexperience well. "Just give her a loose rein and relax. She'll look after you," Saul said, trotting alongside her. This was the best ride Eliza had had yet, and she actually had the confidence to look around and enjoy their surroundings once she had gotten the feel of the mare's sure-footed gait beneath her. The leaves on the trees whispered in the breeze, and the majestic arc of the mountains stretching into the distance almost took her breath away. It was so stunning. As they crested the top of the hill, Saul reined his horse in and grinned back at Eliza. "Reckon you could get used to this?" He swept his arm wide with a sense of pride mingled with gratitude. "I think it's like heaven on earth," Eliza said. "What an incredible place to raise a family and live a peaceful life." She blushed as she realized what she'd said. "I mean, your mom must have thought it was an incredible place to raise you and Thomas." Saul dismounted and helped Eliza out of her saddle. As her feet reached the ground, he held her encircled in his arms for a moment longer than necessary, giving her a shy smile. "You're quite right, and it will be an incredible place to raise our family, Eliza. I'm sorry I was short with you yesterday. I'll tell you more about it tonight when we've finished our work." Eliza felt her heart beat faster as she looked up into his bright blue eyes, thankful that he was willing to tell her what was on his mind after all. "I guess you'd better show me what to do. Fencing is another new thing to me." The next couple of hours passed quickly as they worked side by side. Eliza held the wooden posts steady as Saul banged them into the ground, and they made good progress. They chatted easily about how Fairville had changed over the years as Saul described the different businesses and some of his acquaintances. "I'll be able to introduce you to some of our neighbors soon," he said, pausing to take a swig of water. "We have a cattle drive when fall is starting to bring them closer to the homestead for the winter, and once it's done, there's a fall festival in town. It's an enjoyable day. Ma bakes for days beforehand, and then after the church service, there's a bonfire in the park and games for the children to play. I expect Blanche will make the cakes this year. She seems to enjoy being in the kitchen more than being out helping Thomas on the land." "I'm looking forward to it already." Eliza glanced up at the wooded sides of the mountains. "I guess this must look pretty spectacular in the fall? I always loved seeing the leaves turning in the park I lived near in Boston, but it was nothing like this." "Some days it looks like the whole mountain is lit up. Winter can feel long if the snow comes early. But it's a good time to hunker down and get all the little jobs done indoors that we don't have time for in the summer." The sun was starting to sink in the sky, and Eliza lifted her hair off her neck to let the breeze cool her. "That's a good day's work," Saul announced. "Time to collect some firewood and set up camp, I reckon." He gave her a sudden grin. "I hope you ain't afraid of a few critters? Most of them keep away because of the fire, but sometimes you hear a mountain lion roar up in the woods. I've got my gun, so we're perfectly safe." Eliza shivered. "I'll be fine as long as you're protecting me." She glanced around nervously as the shadows lengthened, but then, on second thoughts, decided it was probably safer than some of the drunken brawls she had encountered on her way home from the mill on many a dark winter's night. "If you look up there, you can see the brightest star." Saul leaned back against the log next to Eliza, pointing up into the firmament. "I feel smaller than a speck of dust," Eliza said as she looked up into the inky sky. "I can hardly believe how the Lord has blessed me to live in a place where I can see so many stars. It's enough to make me dizzy." The wood smoke from their campfire drifted up into the air, and Eliza tightened her shawl around her shoulders. They had eaten well, and now her eyelids were heavy with sleep, but she fought her tiredness, not wanting to miss a moment of how the night was unfolding. Saul whittled a stick quietly with his knife. He glanced in her direction as though coming to a decision. "There's not much to tell about the problems with Blanche, really," he said slowly. "Thomas and I always assumed we would farm the ranch together after Pa got too old. But a few months ago, he surprised us by saying he wanted to divide the place in two. It's because he fell out with his brother, my Uncle Hal, many years ago. I think he was worried in case Thomas and I ever fell out in the same way." Eliza nodded to show she understood. "You and Thomas seem like a good match when it comes to working together." "We are," Saul replied. "At least we were. We always just got on with things, but since Pa's decision, everything feels different." "Kind of like the very thing your father wanted to avoid has started to happen, you mean?" Eliza rested her hand on Saul's arm. "Maybe you and Thomas could tell him you'd rather keep the ranch as one." Saul shrugged. "It's not really my place to go against Pa's wishes." His expression looked troubled in the flickering firelight. "I think if it was just down to Thomas and me, we'd make the division work. The problem is that it seems to have brought out the worst in Blanche. I don't know what to do to make it better." The breeze picked up a little, and Saul threw another log on the fire, sending a shower of sparks into the sky. Eliza yawned and wriggled down so she was lying flat on the rug that Mary had packed for her. She pulled her blanket up over her shoulders, suddenly feeling overcome with tiredness from all the fresh air. I'll have a talk with her, she mumbled, already drifting off to sleep. Surely she wants you all to get along. Chapter 12. Let's ride by the lake on the way home. Saul helped Eliza into her saddle before jumping up lightly onto his own horse. Having the lake is one of the reasons this ranch is so successful, he continued. Even in the driest summers, we always have enough water for our stock, thank the Lord. Your parents chose wisely when they staked a claim on this plot of land all those years ago, Eliza replied. She felt happy and contented after her night under the stars, but more importantly, closer than ever to Saul. I think last night was the best night's sleep I've ever had. I'm taking that as a sign that your heart is already being won over by Summit Lake Ranch. And by you, Eliza thought, as their horses broke into a steady lope. Pa was worried you wouldn't take to it, but Ma told him to have faith. I could tell from your letters that you were a brave woman. Not many would get over the heartbreaks you've had and still be so cheerful. You'll make me blush with all these compliments, Eliza shot back. She clicked her tongue and overtook him, her long auburn hair streaming down her back. Now that she'd gotten used to the mare, she was enjoying horse riding more than she would have expected to. It gave her a sense of freedom and connection to the land, as she imagined all the times Mary and David had covered the same route on horseback over the years. A few minutes later, they rounded the corner, and the lake came into view ahead of them. Thomas was banging fence posts into the ground, and Blanche was with him, which surprised Eliza. Looks like she does enjoy outdoor jobs after all. Eliza's smile faded as she looked at Saul. His face was dark with anger. He's gone behind my back and started dividing the ranch, Saul growled. He raised his hand and pointed at the line of fencing which skirted around the western edge of the lake, blocking it off completely on one side. We were meant to both have access to the lake, but he's taken it all for himself. This must be Blanche's doing. Before Eliza could reply, Saul flicked his reins, and his horse reared and then shot across the paddock at a gallop, closing the distance in less than a minute. What are you doing? His shout echoed across the ranch, and Eliza saw Blanche cross her arms defensively, standing next to Thomas. She followed behind as fast as she could on her mare, and arrived just as Saul had vaulted off his horse and strode across to his brother. It's just a bit of fencing, Saul. No need to get in a lather about it. Thomas leaned on the heavy sledgehammer and tilted his hat to the back of his head. We agreed that we wouldn't fence the lake off, so both of our cattle could always get water from either side. Saul gestured at how much of the fence was already finished. Why didn't you wait so we could do it together, Thomas? What's the hurry? Blanche pursed her lips, not liking Saul's tone. Thomas will likely end up having a bigger herd of cattle than you, Saul, so it's only fair that we have the lake on our side of the property. You'll still have the ponds over yonder. She tossed her curls dismissively and turned back to where she'd been working. Do Ma and Pa know about this? Saul demanded, ignoring Blanche. Thomas flushed guiltily. I don't want to bother them with the details. You said yourself we should just get on with it. Besides, shouldn't you be getting ready for your marriage? You know as well as I do that those ponds dry up when we're short of rain, Thomas. Don't you remember that drought when we were boys? They were like dust, and it was only the water in the lake that kept us going. How will I manage if that happens again? Quit your whining, Saul, Thomas said darkly. I need to think of the future for Blanche and me. It's time for you and that woman of yours to lead your own lives. We don't need to be in each other's pockets. This is all Blanche's fault, Saul roared. Ever since she came, you've turned selfish, Thomas. It's breaking Ma's heart. Can't you see that? Eliza put a restraining hand on Saul's arm, but suddenly Thomas lunged at his brother with his fists bunched. You speak about my wife like that again, and I'll make you sorry. And how about you show a bit of respect for Eliza? Saul retorted. The two brothers lunged at each other again, wrestling like two angry bears. Stop it, both of you. Eliza looked on in horror as she saw their arms windmilling and heard the thud of punches landing. It was impossible to see who was fighting whom. They both seemed to be determined to beat the other into submission. Thomas! Saul! Behave yourselves, for pity's sake. Blanche's face was pale with shock, and she looked at Eliza, now knowing how they could put an end to the terrible rift that was wrenching the Landelle family apart in front of their eyes. A second later, the two brothers seemed to come to their senses, and they staggered backward, opening up some distance between themselves. "I can't believe it's come to this," Saul muttered. He turned on his heel. "Let's go home, Eliza. This isn't how I want things to end." Thomas stood doubled over with his hands on his knees, shaking his head. "This ain't over, Saul," he grunted. The atmosphere was strained over dinner. Blanche had pleaded a headache and retired to her room, and Thomas had declared that he was going over to the neighbors to pay them for some grain. Saul scarcely spoke, and the only sound was the clock ticking on the mantelshelf and Maisie snuffling in her sleep by the hearth. "Have you boys had an argument?" Mary frowned as she poured coffee into 4 cups at the end of the meal after any attempts to get the truth out of Saul had failed. "It's nothing, Ma," Saul said wearily. He gave Eliza an apologetic glance. "I need to ride out to the boundary if you don't mind being alone this evening. Pa said he saw cougar tracks, and we've got young stock over there that we can't afford to lose." "Of course." She gave him a reassuring smile. "I'm going to sew more of my quilt. Don't worry about me." After Eliza had finished cleaning up the dishes, she went to her room to fetch her sewing basket. Clouds had rolled in over the mountains during dinner, and it was a muggy evening. She selected some fabric scraps to work with and decided to go and sit in the garden on the bench under the apple tree. It was the perfect place to stay cool. And she didn't want to be drawn into a conversation with Mary and David until Saul had had a chance to speak to them first. "Come on, Maisie," Eliza called to the dog, who bounded happily past her. The path wound between flower beds, and she breathed in the fragrant scent from the roses, feeling calmer already. Suddenly, Maisie stopped in front of her and whined. "What is it, girl?" Eliza tilted her head to listen. Mary had told her they sometimes had rattlesnakes near the homestead, but she was sure Maisie would have growled if she sensed danger. The sound of muffled crying reached Eliza, and she tiptoed forward, not wanting to intrude. Blanche was sitting on the bench, and she looked up at Eliza, her cheeks wet with tears. "Blanche, I'm sorry. I'll leave you in peace." "No, I don't want to be alone." Blanche's voice was ragged, and Eliza could see she had been crying for some time. "I owe you an apology." She sniffed and rubbed her eyes with a crumpled handkerchief. Eliza's heart went out to her. With her shoulders hunched and her tear-stained cheeks, Blanche reminded her of the forlorn children she had often seen sitting in the stairwell of the old tenement building in Boston, in despair for their wretched lives. "How can I help you, Blanche?" Eliza sat down softly next to her and patted her arm. "We don't need to quarrel, do we? I've always longed to have a sister. Could we find a way to be better friends?" Blanche gave her a watery smile, looking brighter. "I always wanted a sister, too." She took a shaky breath, and tears pooled in her eyes again. "The thing is, I've always found it hard to make friends because I was raised in an orphanage. No sooner did I make a new friend than they would get adopted or sent out to work. It made me feel as though it was better not to have any friends because it was always too upsetting when they left." "Oh, Blanche, you poor thing. You've had a difficult start in life, and I can understand why it makes you wary. I lost my parents, too," Eliza confided. "But I was older, and I do have a brother, although he left shortly afterward, and I don't see him anymore." Blanche looked surprised. "I didn't realize that your parents had died. We have that in common." She picked at the corner of her handkerchief and sighed deeply. "What else is troubling you?" Eliza asked. "I used to have a lovely neighbor called Mrs. Jackson. She was my only friend, really, and she always used to say that a trouble shared is a trouble halved." Blanche nodded. "We had one kind matron at the orphanage who used to say that, too." She gave Eliza a worried look as though she didn't want to carry on. "Whatever you say to me is in the strictest confidence, Blanche. Of course, your loyalty is to Thomas, and mine is to Saul, but that doesn't mean we can't help each other as well. I wanted so badly to be a good wife to Thomas, and because I had so little of my own at the orphanage, I think I let the idea of being mistress of the ranch go to my head." Blanche looked shamefaced, and then gave Eliza a beseeching look. "I never wanted to cause a rift between Thomas and Saul." I guess I was jealous when you arrived." Eliza tried to hide her shock but couldn't. "Jealous of me?" she chuckled. "You looked so poised and sure of yourself, Blanche. I could barely speak, I was so nervous." "But you've settled into ranch life far better than me," Blanche insisted. "You're so good with the animals. I heard David singing your praises the other day. And Mary is so fond of you, it's plain to see. I don't think I'll ever match up to you." Eliza nodded slowly, understanding Blanche's worries now. "Look how good you are at cooking, though, Blanche. Saul told me that David thinks you're a wonderful cook, easily as good as Mary. Don't you think it's beneficial that we both have different strengths? I have to be good at gardening and helping with the animals because I'm a rather mediocre cook. I've never managed to make a successful fruitcake yet." She gave Blanche a rueful smile. "I was hoping you would teach me so Saul won't be too disappointed come Christmas." Blanche burst out laughing and shook her head. "I've been a bit of a fool, haven't I?" She grew serious again. "I don't want there to be any animosity between Thomas and Saul. Do you think there's something we can do to help them patch things up? I think between us we could come up with a plan." The two women linked arms and strolled back through the garden, deep in conversation. Across the yard, Mary watched them with a smile on her face. She had been worried that the new brides of Summit Lake Ranch might end up being its downfall, but her heart felt lighter than it had in days as she gathered the washing off the line. She decided she would pray for healing that night and for the happiness of the generation coming after her and David. Chapter 13. A picnic? "I'm not sure we have time for that, do we, Mary?" David looked confused as his wife helped him down from the wagon. She had insisted she would drive, and she quickly tethered the horse under the tree. "Are you forgetting all the times we used to take our lunch out to the paddocks when the boys were young?" She helped her husband down from the seat at the front of the wagon and handed him his cane. "Of course not." He looked lovingly into Mary's blue eyes, not seeing how they had faded with age. She had always been beautiful to him, and he dropped a kiss on her gray curls. They were happy times. "And there will be many more to come," Mary said, giving him an impish smile. "Will you join us?" Blanche asked demurely. She gestured at the wooden table in the dappled shade by the edge of the lake where Eliza was waiting. There was a jug of roses at the center, and plates of food covered with muslin until they were ready to eat. "You've been busy," David said with a smile. "I do have a soft spot for your ham pie, Blanche. I'm hoping there might be some on one of those plates. And your freshly churned butter goes so well with Blanche's bread, Eliza. It's a great relief to me that you're both such a help in taking over Mary's chores." Eliza and Blanche shared a secret smile, acknowledging that their father-in-law was even-handed in his compliments. "This is a surprise." Saul strode down the track toward them, frowning with puzzlement. "You didn't tell me we were meeting the others, Eliza. I thought you wanted my help with something in the garden?" At the same moment, a drum of hoofbeats announced Thomas's arrival. He dismounted and let his horse start grazing, shooting his brother a wary look. "I can't stop long, Blanche. There's work to be done. I didn't realize it was a family gathering." As Saul and Thomas stood near the table, waiting for an explanation, the air crackled with tension. Eliza took some plates from a basket and laid 6 places, and Blanche poured out 6 glasses of water. Suddenly, Thomas couldn't take it a moment longer. "I don't think Saul and I can sit and eat together as though nothing's wrong," he said, scowling at his brother. "And I can't eat until he's given us an apology, Eliza," Saul shot back. He folded his arms stubbornly, not moving any closer to the table. "Is somebody going to tell me what is going on?" David hobbled over to the table and pulled a chair out for Mary, then sat down heavily next to her. "I might be old, but I'm not blind. I can see you 2 boys are both being as stubborn as a pair of mules about something. We'll sit and settle it here and now like the good Lord would want us to." His firm words brooked no argument, and Saul and Thomas sat down at opposite ends of the table, still not quite able to look each other in the eye. "I think Blanche and Eliza might like to say a few words before we start eating," Mary said, glancing between the 2 women. The Landelle men all looked startled and sat back in their seats, not daring to disobey Mary. "Thank you," Blanche said. giving her mother-in-law a grateful look. She took a deep breath, and Eliza came and stood next to her, nodding with encouragement. Eliza and I would like to make a suggestion. We would very much like it if the ranch could stay as it is, as one shared business that we can all work on together. David Landelle's face darkened, and he turned to look at Mary. Did you know about this? Are you happy to let them go against my wishes when they've been here such a short time? I think Blanche and Eliza are right, my dear, Mary said gently. She tucked her hand into the crook of David's elbow. We raised Saul and Thomas to work together for the good of all of us. They're nothing like your brother Hal. Blanche gulped and continued. I owe you an apology, Saul. I got carried away with the thought that Thomas and I should have more. The truth is, it's because I've never had anything I could call my own, which made me struggle with the idea of sharing. Eliza stepped forward to support her. Blanche and I both come from very different backgrounds compared to how you were raised on the ranch. After talking last night, we found out we have a lot in common from our pasts. But more importantly, what we have in common is that we want to be part of the Landelle family and to help Summit Lake Ranch succeed. I know it's forward of us to make a suggestion like this, but we think the place will do better as the ranch you worked so hard to make it what it is today, Mr. Landelle, not divided into two. Thomas looked across the table at Saul, momentarily lost for words, before giving a sudden deep-throated chuckle. I think the women know us better than we know ourselves, Saul. He jumped up and strode around, offering his brother a hand to shake. I've been a fool about this fence in the lake. Am I forgiven? Saul stood up and gave his brother a bear hug, slapping him on his back. If you've been a fool, I haven't exactly conducted myself very well either, he exclaimed. You know we always work better as a team. They both turned to David and Mary. Will you at least give us a chance to work the place as one, Pa? Thomas asked. Blanche and I don't mind which log cabin we have, as long as this silly quarrel can be resolved. I think it would be nice for Blanche to have the new log cabin, Eliza said stoutly, walking over to be by Saul's side. She deserves to have something new, to make a home for her and Thomas after being raised in an orphanage. And the old cabin is so homey. I've gotten rather attached to being there. You'd like that too, wouldn't you, Saul? She gave him a persuasive smile, and he nodded, feeling his heart swell with gratitude at the way she and Blanche had sorted out their differences so readily. If that's what you're all agreed on, then I'm happy to give my consent, David said slowly. He gave his two sons a firm look. I reckon you could learn a thing or two from the women, don't you, Mary? I seem to recall that's what your pa said to you once upon a time, she said, stifling a laugh at David's expression. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm famished. Are we going to eat this good food or not? Thomas rubbed his hands together and pulled a chair out for Blanche to sit down next to him. I have got one more thing to mention, Blanche said. She slipped her hand into Thomas's and looked up at him. We'd better not take too long building the cabin because we'll need room for a baby within a few months. I thought it was just the heat making me tired, but the doctor said different. Thomas whooped with happiness and put his arm around Blanche, pulling her closer. The first Landelle grandchild? I can hardly believe my ears. Congratulations, Blanche. I'm so happy for you. Eliza rushed forward and hugged her, feeling a surge of happiness that their idea to reconcile the family had paved the way for such exciting news. I think this calls for a toast, Saul said. He raised his glass and looked around at everyone. Here's to the Landelle family being blessed with Thomas and Blanche's new baby, and here's to Summit Lake Ranch continuing to grow and provide for us all, thanks to the Lord's bountiful mercy. Praise the Lord, the family called, pausing for a moment to reflect on how fortunate they were to be together. By the end of the meal, Eliza and Blanche knew the conflict had been resolved. David and Thomas were already making plans on which trees would be best to make the new log cabin, and Mary was happily discussing what she could make for Blanche to make the place cozy for the winter. Let me show you another one of my favorite spots on the ranch, Saul said quietly. He took Eliza's hand and led her away from the table along the edge of the lake until they were under the next cluster of trees. I used to come and sit here when I was a boy. If you're quiet, You can watch the birds swooping over the water at dusk, and then you'll see the sunset reflected. I'm looking forward to you showing me one day." Eliza sighed happily. "Blanche really was sorry," she said, looking up at Saul, wanting him to understand. "I know," he said simply. He looked suddenly serious. "I'm sorry you didn't see the best of me yesterday, fighting with Thomas. It's never happened before, and I promise it won't happen again. Ma and Pa raised us to be better than that. I hope it hasn't made you have second thoughts." Eliza shook her head. "I know it was only out of wanting the best for the ranch, and that's what Blanche and I want too. You're a kind-hearted woman." Saul took both of her hands and held them against his chest, feeling the surge of protectiveness again as he looked deep into her eyes. "I haven't asked you officially. Will you be my wife, Eliza? I honestly never dreamt I would find someone so special the day I placed that advertisement. I'm still pinching myself. Can we go ahead and book the pastor to marry us?" Eliza hesitated for a beat, wanting to savor the moment. Her heart fluttered in her chest, and she nodded. "I was worried I might not fit into your life on the ranch, but I've never been happier, Saul. I want to be by your side forever." "Yes, please. Being your wife would make me so happy." Before she could utter another word, Saul swept her into a passionate embrace, letting his lips linger on hers as she melted into his arms. Eliza felt as though her heart would explode with happiness. The long, lonely nights in Boston drifted from her memory like mist vanishing in the morning sun, and she finally knew this was where she belonged, at Summit Lake Ranch, by Saul's side. "Shall we go and tell your family the good news?" Eliza leaned back and looked up into Saul's blue eyes. His arms around her felt strong and tender, and she realized that she had never felt love like this before. "I reckon so," Saul said, pressing another kiss on her lips. "Ma told me when I read her your first letter that she had a feeling we were right for each other. Her and Pa will be so happy to have you in the family, Mrs. Landelle." "It's a good thing I invited you to the picnic today, then," she said, giving him a mischievous grin. "I reckon you'll be surprising me for many years to come," Saul declared. He put his hands around her waist and twirled her in a circle as their breathless laughter drifted toward the others on the breeze. Mary's eyes twinkled as she shared a soft smile with David. They both knew their sons had found good, kind women to marry, which was all they had ever wished for. Epilogue. The smoke drifted up from the chimney of the cabin as Eliza and Saul dismounted from their horses. There was already a thick blanket of snow on the ground, and the snowflakes swirled and danced in the wind as they fell from the gray clouds overhead. "That's our jobs done for today, and not a moment too soon by the look of the weather." Saul led the two horses into the barn, and Eliza followed. The sweet scent of meadow hay reminded her of when she had first arrived at the ranch, and she let her mind drift as Saul hung the saddles up and fed the horses. After the picnic by the river, when Saul had asked her if they could book the pastor, they had been married by the end of the month. It had been a simple affair, witnessed only by the Landelles, and Eliza had been pleased to have Blanche as her maid of honor. She could still remember the emotion that had welled up inside her as she promised everlasting love and loyalty to Saul. It was a moment that would fill her with wonder for the rest of her life, and she could see by the look in Saul's eyes that it had the same significance for him as well. Our first Christmas Eve together. Saul stood next to Eliza in the barn doorway, looking out at the land, and gently brushed the snowflakes from her auburn curls. "I can't believe it's come around so fast." He wrapped his arms around her shoulders and pressed a kiss on her mouth, feeling the mingling of cold and heat as they touched. Eliza plucked a wisp of hay from Saul's hair and gave him another kiss, enjoying the moment of intimacy and the way his eyes softened when he looked at her. "We'd better get inside. Blanche has been cooking all day while your ma minded baby Thomas Jr. She told me not to be late back from checking the animals." The warmth from the crackling fire in the hearth made the log cabin feel cozy after the crisp winter air outside, and Eliza bustled around, closing the drapes to keep the cold out. Even though Thomas and Blanche had moved into their new cabin on top of the hill weeks ago, They had decided to gather in the old one for their traditional Christmas Eve celebration of roast ham and potatoes after decorating the small fir tree in the corner of the room. Saul had told her they did it because often the weather was too harsh for them to get into town for the annual fair in the park. And Eliza found the aromatic pine scent mingling with cinnamon and spices from Blanche's baking made her feel very festive. "This smells delicious, Blanche." She stood companionably next to her sister-in-law as they spooned the feast onto warmed platters. "All made with vegetables from your garden," Blanche replied with a smile. "We make a good team, don't we?" The two wives had settled amicably into their roles, especially after Mary was doing less after a bout of influenza, which had weakened her. Eliza liked the fact that Mary and David shared the old log cabin with her and Saul, but that Blanche and Thomas were only a short walk away. It made her feel as though they had their own small community, which made up for any rare moments of feeling isolated because of living out of town. "How's my boy?" Thomas's cheeks were red from the cold as he came in from outside to join them, stamping the snow from his boots. He shrugged his coat off and hung it up, looking forward to an evening with everyone. Saul leaned over the baby's crib and grinned up at his brother. "He's got a good set of lungs on him, Thomas. Takes after you in that respect," Ma was saying earlier. The easy conversation flowed between the extended family as Eliza lit the candles on the table, casting a soft glow around the room. Boston felt like a lifetime ago, and she allowed herself a small moment of reflection to remember Nathan with fondness. She had been so lonely and heartbroken when he had been killed in battle, and then terrified by Mr. Romano's threats to make her his wife against her will. But without the upsetting times, she never would have headed west and fallen in love with Saul. It was humbling, and not a day went by without her giving thanks for the way she had experienced God's grace after such darkness in her life. Her hand brushed over her belly, and she smiled to herself as she watched Saul tickling his nephew under his chin where he gurgled in Thomas's arms. Soon, she would be able to experience more of God's grace in the arrival of her firstborn child. But first, she had to share her cherished secret with her new family. Mary and David had become like parents to her, and Blanche and Thomas as dear as any siblings she might have longed for after her own brother had abandoned her. At first, it had felt disloyal to think of them that way, but now Eliza was grateful that the Lord had blessed her with another family after losing her own, and she knew her ma would have approved of the close-knit Landelle folks who had welcomed her as one of their own. I think it's time for our traditional Bible verse before singing some carols by the fire. Saul picked the well-thumbed family Bible up from the desk in the corner, and it fell open at the spot he had already marked. "What a lovely tradition," Eliza said, standing close to Saul and lowering her eyes. "Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows." "I think this verse reflects what the year has meant for all of us," Saul said, smiling around at all the people he held so dear as they nodded in agreement. "Amen to that," Blanche replied, taking baby Thomas Jr. into her arms and leaning against Thomas. Saul held Eliza's gaze, noticing the way her cheeks were glowing and her eyes sparkled in the candlelight. His breath caught in his throat as he marveled at the wonders of God's plan that had delivered her to him and how his hand had guided them to marriage, ending the loneliness he had thought was to be his future. Eliza had been waiting for the right moment to share her news all week. But with the heavy snowfall and preparations for Christmas, there had hardly been a moment to spare. But now, gathered with her family and the man she loved so much, it almost made her heart ache with happiness. She knew the moment had arrived. "God has blessed us with another perfect gift, Saul. We'll be welcoming a new baby into the Landelle clan next year." Saul gasped and pulled her into an embrace, gently resting his hand on her belly as his eyes misted over with emotion. "You're with child?" Eliza nodded, smiling broadly. "The doctor confirmed it when we were last in town. We're having a baby right about late springtime." Blanche clapped her hands with delight, and Mary dabbed a handkerchief at her eyes. "What a wonderful year this has turned out to be," Mary cried. I'll be a grandma to two beautiful grandchildren, David. Do you remember last Christmas? How you said it was about time we had the sound of children back at the ranch. The Lord must have been listening to our prayers. Watch out, David said jovially to Blanche and Eliza. She'll spoil them rotten given half a chance. Hush now, Mary replied, giving her husband a good-natured nudge. What are grandparents for if not to spoil the little ones? I know you'll be carving toys for them both by the fireside all winter. Eliza laughed, enjoying the sense of closeness in the family. She leaned against Saul's broad chest, and they shared a secretive smile, knowing that they were both thinking about how blessed they were. I love you, Saul, Eliza whispered as her heart overflowed with gratitude. I love you too, Saul replied, holding her within the protective circle of his arms. The sound of joyful chatter and laughter filled the cabin as the snowflakes softly fell outside and darkness crept over the land. The year might have begun with loneliness, but now Eliza realized that the Lord's plan for her and Saul to continue the good work of the Landelle family was only just beginning. They would grow old together, with God's grace guiding them every step of the way, and life was better than she could ever have imagined. The end. Thank you for listening to this free audiobook, and we hope you enjoyed it. Martha Gillcrest writes clean romance stories that sweep you away to when times were simpler, with plenty of love and adventure to entertain you. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like it with a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. That way, you will always know when a new audiobook has been added for your listening pleasure.